Welcome to Warhammer 40,000 Lore to Sleep To. Today we'll be exploring the origins and other details of Perturabo, Primarch of the Iron Warriors Legiones Astartes. So lie back, relax, and let's begin. The Child of Olympia. Long before the wars that would shape the galaxy, before the siege lines and the iron fortresses, before the bitterness that would come to define him, there was a child. A child who fell, as all Primarchs fell, scattered across the stars by forces older and stranger than memory. He came to rest on Olympia, a world of towering city-states, political intrigue, and ancient stone. And from the very first moments of his life there, it was clear that he was something apart from ordinary men. Where other children learned slowly, stumbling through the early years of life, Perturabo absorbed everything around him with an unsettling completeness. Language, mathematics, architecture, philosophy, all of it seemed to flow into him like water into a vessel perfectly shaped to receive it. The people of Olympia had never seen anything quite like him. They were a proud people, accustomed to valuing intellect and strength in equal measure, but this boy defied their every expectation of what a mind could do. He was, by any measure, a prodigy, and yet even in those earliest years, there was something behind his eyes that those who knew him found difficult to name. Not darkness, not exactly. Something more like a deep and restless hunger, an intelligence that the world around it could not quite satisfy. Olympia was not a gentle world. Its city-states rose like iron crowns from jagged mountain ranges, each one ruled by lords and tyrants who maintained their power through a careful balance of force, diplomacy, and fear. It was a world that understood hierarchy instinctively, where strength was respected and weakness invited ruin. Into this environment came the young Primarch, and it did not take long for the ruling class of Olympia to recognize what they had found. The boy was not merely gifted. He was extraordinary in ways that transcended ordinary ambition, and the powerful men who governed the city-state saw in him something they could use. Pacts were made. Agreements struck between the tyrants of Olympia and the growing legend of the child who could do things no ordinary human could. These were not alliances of equals, they were arrangements of convenience, wrapped in the language of honor and tradition. Perturabo, even then, was perceptive enough to understand what was happening around him. He could see the calculations in the eyes of those who claimed to welcome him. He accepted their terms not out of naivety, but because he understood that power, on a world like Olympia, required a foundation, and foundations, as he would spend his entire life proving, were things he knew how to build. Olympia shaped Perturabo in ways that even his own transhuman nature could not entirely override. It was a world of contrasts, breathtaking in its mountainous grandeur, suffocating in its political complexity. The city-states that dotted its landscape were ancient things, built over generations in stone and iron, each one a monument to the ambitions of the dynasty that controlled it. To grow up on Olympia was to grow up surrounded by walls, literal and figurative. Walls that kept enemies out, walls that kept subjects in, walls that reminded everyone within them of who held power and who did not. For a mind like Perturabo's, this environment was both a school and a cage. He learned from it ceaselessly, studying the architecture of the fortresses around him, the political machinery of the tyrants, the way that stone and steel and fear could be combined into something that endured. But he also chafed against it. Olympia gave him tools and gave him context, but it could not give him peers. It could not give him a conversation that matched the speed of his own thoughts, or a challenge that did not resolve itself within moments of his attention falling upon it. He was of Olympia, shaped by its hard edges and its cold stone, but even as a youth, some part of him must have known that he was meant for something vaster, and that Olympia, for all its grandeur, was only the beginning. Of all the figures in Perturabo's early life, none left a deeper mark than Damikos, the tyrant of Lochos. It was Damikos who took the young Primarch in, who raised him in the halls of power and gave him the closest thing to a family that Olympia could offer. And it was Damikos, in his own way, who first taught Perturabo the particular pain of being valued not for who you are, but for what you can do. Damikos was not a cruel man, by the standards of Olympian rulers. But he was a pragmatic one. He understood, with the cold clarity of a man who had survived decades of political intrigue, that the extraordinary child in his care was an asset, perhaps the greatest asset any tyrant on Olympia had ever possessed. He used Perturabo's gifts to consolidate his power, to win wars, to intimidate rivals. And Perturabo, with his perfect memory and his flawless perception, could see exactly what was happening. Every deployment of his genius was also a reminder that his genius was the reason he was kept. It planted something in him, not hatred, not quite, but a deep and abiding wariness. A sense that affection, in a world of power, was always conditional. That those who claimed to care for you were always, somewhere beneath the surface, counting what you were worth to them. In the courts of Damikos, amidst the cold stone and the political calculation, there was one relationship that seemed to exist outside the usual transactions of power. Caliphone was the daughter of Damikos, and where the rest of the court regarded Perturabo with a mixture of awe and wariness, she met him simply, as a person. The bond that formed between them was one of the few genuine warmths in Perturabo's early life. She did not want something from him. She did not study his capabilities or whisper to her father about how best to use them. She simply spent time with him, talked with him, and in doing so gave him something that Olympia, for all its grandeur, had rarely offered, the experience of being known rather than appraised. For a mind as analytical as Perturabo's, this was more significant than it might sound. He spent his days perceiving the hidden structures of everything around him, the stress fractures in stone, the false notes in a diplomat's smile, the weaknesses in a wall's construction. To encounter someone who seemed to have no hidden architecture, no ulterior calculation, was remarkable. Whether the bond they shared was that of siblings, or something more complex, scholars of the era have debated. What seems beyond doubt is that Caliphone represented something irreplaceable to him, and that her memory would remain with him long after Olympia itself had changed beyond recognition. Among Perturabo's many gifts was one that, in a quieter life, might have defined him entirely, the ability to create works of extraordinary beauty. He was a sculptor of rare talent, capable of producing pieces of such technical and aesthetic refinement that those who saw them struggled to believe they had been made by hand rather than by some process beyond human comprehension. His understanding of form, proportion, and material was flawless in the same way that his understanding of fortification and mathematics was flawless, total, immediate, and precise. But this gift carried within it the seed of a particular torment. Because Perturabo's perception was, in every domain, absolute, he could see not only what he had created, but the precise distance between what he had created and what he had envisioned. Other artists might finish a piece and feel satisfaction, the gap between intention and execution blurred by the limitations of their own sight. Perturabo had no such mercy. Every sculpture he completed was, to his eyes, a record of failure, not gross failure, not incompetence, but the infinitely fine failure of the real falling short of the ideal. He could see every place where the stone had not done exactly what his mind had demanded of it. What should have been a source of pride became instead a source of quiet, chronic pain, a reminder, in every finished work, that even he could not make the world conform perfectly to his will. The frustration that grew from Perturabo's artistic gifts was not a simple thing, and it would be a mistake to reduce it to mere perfectionism. It was something more structural than that, a fundamental incompatibility between the nature of his mind and the nature of the physical world. His intellect operated in the realm of the ideal. When he conceived of a form, he conceived of it completely, every angle, every surface, every relationship between part and whole, with a clarity and totality that no material could ever fully express. Stone had grain. Metal had impurities. Even the steadiest hand introduced variation. And Perturabo's senses were acute enough to find every single one of these deviations, no matter how microscopic. Over time, this frustration extended beyond sculpture into every domain of his life. He would design a fortification and see, even as it was being built, all the small ways in which the construction fell short of his original vision. He would formulate a strategy and watch it execute with a growing awareness of the 1,000 minor imperfections accumulating in its implementation. The world, it seemed to him, was always slightly wrong, always fractionally less than it should have been. For most people, this gap is invisible. For Perturabo, it was simply the permanent condition of existence. And there is something quietly exhausting about that, to see, always and without relief, the distance between what is and what could be. In the court of Damocles, there was a sculptor named Andos, a man of considerable reputation and, by the standards of Olympia, genuine talent. He had spent years building his name, earning the admiration of the tyrant's court and the respect of his peers. And then Perturabo had arrived, and everything Andos had built his identity upon had quietly ceased to mean very much. This kind of rivalry is, in some ways, the cruelest variety, because it requires no malice to inflict its wounds. Perturabo did not set out to diminish Andos. He simply existed, and in existing, made visible the distance between ordinary excellence and something that transcended ordinary categories entirely. Andos could see it, as any skilled craftsman can see when they are in the presence of something that surpasses them. Whether he responded to this with grace or with bitterness, the sources do not record in full detail. What they suggest is that the dynamic between them became a source of tension in the court, and that Perturabo was aware of it, aware, with that unfailing perception of his, of the resentment he generated simply by being what he was. It was a pattern that would repeat itself throughout his life. He did not seek to overshadow others. He could not help it. And the loneliness that came from being perpetually, irrevocably beyond the reach of those around him would follow him for centuries to come. Perturabo's mind did not restrict itself to the physical and the mathematical. It ranged freely across every domain of human thought, and philosophy, the oldest and most contested of Olympia's intellectual traditions, drew his attention as surely as architecture or engineering. He was not a philosopher in the contemplative, withdrawn sense. He engaged with ideas as he engaged with fortifications, actively, analytically, looking always for the weaknesses in an argument's structure, the points at which its logic failed to support the weight being placed upon it. In the courts and academies of Olympia, philosophical debate was a serious pursuit, a form of intellectual combat with real stakes in a culture that valued the strength of the mind. Perturabo moved through these debates with the same quiet, devastating efficiency that he brought to every other field. He did not shout or perform. He listened, identified the flaw, and then placed his objection with the precision of a blade finding the gap in a suit of armor. Those who debated him often found, to their discomfort, that they had lost before they fully understood how the exchange had turned against them. It gave him a reputation, among Olympia's thinkers, that was equal parts admiration and unease. He was too good at this, too fast, too thorough. Engaging with him philosophically was less a conversation and more an education in the limits of your own thinking. There is an account, preserved in the chronicles of Olympia, of a gathering of the world's most senior religious figures, priests of the old faith, men and women who had spent entire lifetimes constructing and defending the theological frameworks that underpinned Olympian society. They were not naive thinkers. They were experienced debaters, versed in every argument for and against their doctrines, hardened by decades of intellectual challenge. And Perturabo, still a young man by any reckoning, took them apart. He did not mock them. He did not rage against their beliefs with the blunt instrument of skepticism. He engaged with their arguments on their own terms, followed each line of reasoning to its conclusion, and demonstrated, with meticulous patience, where each one failed. One by one, the priests found their positions untenable. One by one, They fell silent, not because they had been shouted down, but because they had been outthought so completely that there was nothing left to say. The silence that descended on that gathering was, by all accounts, a profound one. And Perturabo, it is said, did not appear triumphant. He appeared, if anything, slightly disappointed, as though he had hoped, this time, that someone would give him something he could not immediately unravel. The victory brought him no particular joy. It simply confirmed, again, what he already knew: that the world had not yet produced his equal. In an age when the warp, that churning, nightmarish dimension of psychic energy, was beginning to press more insistently against the boundaries of the material world, Perturabo's thoughts turned, as they always did, toward fortification. But this time, the walls he envisioned were of a different kind. He became deeply interested in the problem of warp incursion, in the question of whether physical architecture could be designed to resist, or at least impede, the intrusion of immaterial forces into real space. This was not a question that most engineers, or even most Space Marine legions, were asking at the time. It required a willingness to take the warp seriously as a physical phenomenon, to study it with the same analytical rigor one might apply to stress loads on a stone buttress. Perturabo applied exactly this rigor. He developed theories about resonance frequencies, about the geometry of spaces that might disrupt psychic coherence, about materials and configurations that could act as barriers against warp energy. Some of these theories were decades ahead of their time. Some of them, it would later emerge, were deeply correct in ways that even their creator may not have fully understood. In a legion that would later be touched by chaos in the most profound of ways, it is not without irony that its Primarch spent years of his early life trying to build walls against the warp. There are feats of engineering attributed to Perturabo that strain credulity even when you account for his transhuman nature, and then there are feats that have been independently verified by enough sources that they must simply be accepted as fact. The carving of a siege rampart through solid mountain rock is among the latter. Faced with a defensive situation that would have taken a conventional engineering corps months to address, Perturabo is recorded as having personally directed, and in large part physically participated in, the excavation of a rampart through terrain that should have been impassable. The speed at which this was accomplished defied the expectations of everyone involved. He worked with a combination of engineered precision and raw physical power that his transhuman frame made possible, directing each strike and each excavation as part of a larger calculated design that he was executing simultaneously in his mind. What emerged was not merely functional, it was elegant. The rampart was positioned with a geometric precision that maximized its defensive advantages, incorporated the natural contours of the rock in ways that actually improved upon the original design, and was completed in a fraction of the time anyone had thought possible. For the soldiers who witnessed it, it was one of those rare moments when the gap between an ordinary human experience of the world and a Primarch's experience of it became briefly, starkly visible. There is a darkness that runs beneath the story of Perturabo's life, and it is not a darkness that arrived suddenly. It was present, in seed form, from very early on. Whether through the nature of his own perception, or through sources more occult than analytical, Perturabo seems to have carried with him a long-standing sense of what his life would ultimately amount to. Not hope, not ambition, though those were present too, but a kind of grim foreknowledge that the path ahead of him would be harder, and lonelier, and more costly than the paths walked by others. This bitter quality to his vision of the future was not simple pessimism. It was grounded, at least in part, in a genuinely clear-eyed assessment of the world around him. He could see the way that power structures worked, the way that those at the top of hierarchies used those below them, the way that extraordinary capability attracted not gratitude but expectation and exploitation. He had seen it in the court of Damocles. He would see it, in time, in the Imperium itself. The prophecy, if it can be called that, was less a vision of specific events and more a settled conviction about the shape of his life, that he would build and build and build, and that others would always benefit from his building more than he ever would himself. Among the more unsettling aspects of Perturabo's nature was a perceptual ability that scholars have struggled to categorize cleanly. He seemed, at certain moments, to perceive things that were not materially present, echoes, after images of events that had occurred or were occurring in proximity to the warp. This was not the overt psychic sight of a sanctioned psyker. It was something quieter and more unsettling than that, a peripheral awareness, as though the edges of his vision occasionally caught glimpses of things that existed in a dimension adjacent to the one he was standing in. He did not advertise this ability, and there is some evidence that he regarded it with considerable discomfort. For a mind as ordered and analytical as his, the warp represented everything he found most threatening: chaos, irrationality, a domain where the rules he had spent his life mastering simply did not apply. To have even partial access to that domain, uninvited and uncontrolled, was not a gift but an intrusion. He would spend years attempting to understand it in engineering terms, to find a framework that could contain and explain what he was seeing. Whether he ever succeeded in making peace with this aspect of his own nature is a question that the historical record does not fully resolve. If the warp echo site was an intrusion, the visions were something worse. There were episodes in Perturabo's life, documented in fragments, alluded to in his own writings, described obliquely by those close enough to witness them, in which his perception of the warp was not a gentle flicker at the edges of his vision but something overwhelming and total. In these moments, the boundary between the material world and whatever lay beyond it seemed to thin to near transparency, and what came through was not clarity but horror, images, impressions, sounds that did not correspond to anything in the physical space around him. What exactly he saw in these visions, he rarely described in detail. What is recorded is the effect they had on him, a deepening of his existing darkness, a confirmation of his most despairing assessments of the future, and a particular kind of exhaustion that seemed to follow each episode, as though the experience of seeing beyond the veil cost him something that was slow to replenish. The cruelty of this curse was that it was entirely involuntary. Perturabo could not choose to look away. He could not build a wall against it, though he tried. The warp came to him on its own terms, and there was nothing in his formidable arsenal of intellect and will that could fully keep it out. There is an argument that Perturabo's greatest gift and his most crippling flaw were, in fact, the same thing. His ability to perceive structural weaknesses was total and automatic. It applied to fortifications and siege lines and enemy formations, but it applied with equal force to everything else his gaze fell upon. A conversation with a colleague revealed, instantly and involuntarily, every flaw in their reasoning. A relationship offered to him was immediately visible in all its structural vulnerabilities. A plan proposed by a trusted subordinate was already disassembled in his mind before the subordinate had finished speaking, every weakness catalogued and assessed. This was extraordinarily useful in war. It made him, arguably, the greatest siege engineer in human history. But it made ordinary life, ordinary human connection, a quietly unbearable experience. He could not simply enjoy a well-made argument without simultaneously noting where it failed. He could not trust in the stability of a friendship without being fully aware of all the conditions under which it would break. He could not look at the Imperium he served without seeing, with absolute clarity, all the ways in which it was already beginning to crack. It is one thing to build walls. It is another thing entirely to spend your whole life seeing, with perfect precision, every wall that will eventually fall. Perturabo forgot nothing. This is not a figure of speech or an exaggeration for rhetorical effect, it is a precise description of his cognitive architecture. Every conversation he had ever participated in was stored and accessible with complete fidelity. Every battle he had ever fought could be replayed in his mind in its entirety. Every slight, every betrayal, every moment of being used or overlooked or taken for granted was preserved in perfect detail, available for recall at any moment, as vivid as the day it had occurred. For a general and an engineer, This was an incalculable advantage. The accumulated experience of centuries of warfare, perfectly catalogued and instantly accessible, gave him a strategic depth that no amount of study could replicate. But outside of professional contexts, eidetic memory is a more complicated gift. It means that nothing fades. The ordinary mercy of time, the way that hurts diminish and slights blur into insignificance, was simply not available to Perturabo. What had been done to him, whether by Damikos or by the Emperor or by the endless attrition of a legion treated as expendable, remained as sharp and immediate in his mind as the day it happened. He carried all of it, always, with perfect clarity. And there is a weight to that kind of memory that ordinary forgetting, for all its other costs, protects most people from ever having to bear. To deceive Perturabo was, for any practical purpose, impossible. His senses operated at a level of acuity that rendered the ordinary tools of deception entirely transparent. Micro-expressions that a human face produces in fractions of a second, involuntary shifts in muscle tension, minute changes in skin coloration, the almost imperceptible hesitation before a carefully constructed answer, were not merely perceptible to him but impossible to miss. He read them as easily and as automatically as another person might read words on a page. This made him, in the political courts of Olympia and later in the councils of the Great Crusade, a figure of considerable unease. People do not, as a general rule, enjoy being in the company of someone who they know cannot be fooled. It creates a particular kind of social tension, the awareness that your performance, your careful management of how you present yourself, is simply not working. That the person across from you is seeing something closer to the truth of you than you have chosen to reveal. For Perturabo himself, it was another form of isolation. To move through a world where almost everyone is, at some level, performing, managing impressions, constructing narratives, softening truths, and to be constitutionally incapable of being taken in by any of it, is to experience a profound and permanent distance from ordinary human interaction. He knew when people lied to him. He always knew. And they usually knew that he knew. The Lord of Iron is forged. The moment when a Primarch first stands before the legion that carries his genetic inheritance is, in the accounts that survive from the Great Crusade, almost always described with a particular quality of inevitability, as though the two halves of something that had always belonged together were finally being brought into alignment. For Perturabo, the reunion with the Fourth Legion was no different in this structural sense, and yet it was different in almost every other way. The Legion he found was not in a good state. They were capable fighters, certainly. The Fourth Legion had been deployed extensively in the early years of the Crusade, but they lacked coherence. They lacked a unifying doctrine, a philosophical core, a sense of identity that ran deeper than their immediate orders. They were soldiers without a clear idea of what kind of soldiers they were meant to be. Perturabo looked at them with the same analytical thoroughness he applied to everything, assessed them completely in what must have seemed to onlookers like a very short space of time, and understood immediately both what they were and what he needed to make of them. The reunion was not, by most accounts, a warm one. There was no great speech of welcome, no ceremonial warmth. He arrived, he looked, he understood, and then he began the work of remaking them in his image. Which, as it turned out, was a rather demanding image to be remade in. Of all the practices associated with the Iron Warriors, this is perhaps the one that most clearly marks the distance between Perturabo's way of thinking and the way that most human beings, or even most space marines, approach questions of discipline and loyalty. Decimation is an ancient practice, borrowed from the military traditions of old Earth. When a unit fails in its duty, 1 in 10 of its members is selected by lot and executed by the remaining 9. It does not target the guilty. It does not distinguish between those who faltered and those who held firm. It falls where chance dictates, and in doing so it makes collective responsibility not merely a principle but a lived and visceral reality. Perturabo implemented this practice within the Iron Warriors with a cold consistency that shocked even those who served alongside the Legion. The reasoning, if you follow it from his perspective, has a certain brutal logic. He had no patience for failure, and even less patience for the kind of gradual erosion of standards that goes unpunished until it becomes catastrophic. Better a sharp and terrible lesson now, than a slow decay that costs more lives later. Whether this reasoning is sound, whether the fear it generated was worth the loyalty it consumed, is a question that different historians have answered differently. What is beyond dispute is that the Iron Warriors did not fail in their duty lightly, in the full knowledge of what failure would cost them. A legion's name is not merely a label. It is a statement of identity, a compressed expression of what the Legion believes itself to be and what it wishes the galaxy to understand about it. When Perturabo took command of the 4th Legion and began the work of reshaping them, one of the earliest and most significant acts was the giving of a new name. They had been known before by designations that said little about their character or their purpose. Now they would be the Iron Warriors. The name was chosen with the same precision that Perturabo brought to everything. It was not poetic in the conventional sense, not evocative of glory or transcendence. It was material. It referred to something hard, enduring, and unornamented. Iron, not gold. Iron, which does not shine but does not break. Iron, which is the substance of walls and bridges and the tools that shape the world. In calling his legion the Iron Warriors, Perturabo was making a statement about what he valued and what he expected. Not brilliance, not spectacle, not the theatrical heroism that some other legions seemed to chase. Endurance. Reliability. The capacity to do what needed to be done, in the worst conditions, for as long as it needed to be done. It was, in its way, a modest name, and in its modesty, perhaps more honest about the nature of war than most. 4 words. And yet within those 4 words, Perturabo compressed an entire philosophy of what it meant to be a warrior, an engineer, and a servant of the Imperium. Iron within, iron without. The outer meaning is immediately legible. The Iron Warriors are armored, fortified, hardened against whatever the galaxy chooses to throw at them. They build walls and they become walls. Their physical resilience is the most visible expression of their identity. But the inner meaning is the more important one. Iron within speaks to something about the mind, the will, the character of the warrior beneath the armor. It demands that the internal architecture of the soldier be as strong as the external. That doubt, despair, exhaustion, and fear be met with the same fortified resistance that a siege line meets an enemy assault. There is something almost cruel about this doctrine, when you consider it carefully. It leaves no space for weakness, no acknowledged room for the ordinary human need to sometimes be less than iron. To be an Iron Warrior, by this doctrine, is to be permanently and completely armored, inside and out, in every weather, in every circumstance. It is a standard that demands everything and concedes nothing. And it was a standard that Perturabo held himself to, perhaps most relentlessly of all, which may explain a great deal about the man he eventually became. The Iron Warriors were not organized in the same manner as most other Space Marine legions. Where many legions divided themselves into companies and chapters with relatively standardized structures, Perturabo imposed upon the 4th Legion an architecture of his own devising, the Grand Companies. Each Grand Company was a substantial and largely self-contained military formation, built around a central command structure but incorporating its own specialist units, its own siege engineers, its own support elements. Think of them less as military units in the conventional sense and more as mobile fortresses, organizations capable of prosecuting a full siege campaign without reference to other formations, drawing on all the necessary expertise from within their own ranks. The Grand Companies reflected Perturabo's engineering instincts applied to military organization. Just as a well-designed fortification incorporates all the elements needed to defend itself without relying on external support, a well-designed Grand Company incorporated all the elements needed to fight without relying on coordination with formations that might not be available. It was a structure built for the kind of warfare the Iron Warriors most commonly found themselves fighting: grinding, attritional, logistically demanding campaigns against fortified enemies in complex terrain. For that kind of warfare, the Grand Company structure was not merely efficient. It was close to optimal. A natural consequence of the Grand Company structure was a degree of operational autonomy that was, by the standards of the Legiones Astartes, quite unusual. Each Grand Company was designed to function independently, and in practice this is largely what they did. The commanders of the Grand Companies, the Lords of Iron, in the parlance that would develop within the Legion, exercised a degree of strategic and tactical discretion that their equivalents in other legions might not have recognized. This autonomy was not unlimited, and it operated within the broader framework of Perturabo's overall command. But it was real, and it had real consequences for the character of the Legion. It meant that different Grand Companies developed distinct personalities over time, distinct areas of specialist expertise, distinct tactical traditions. It meant that the Iron Warriors as a whole were less a monolithic instrument and more a collection of highly capable, semi-independent formations that could be coordinated toward common ends when necessary but were equally capable of operating alone. Whether Perturabo designed this deliberately or whether it was a natural consequence of an organizational structure optimized for independent siege operations is difficult to say. Perhaps both. He was not, in any case, a Primarch who placed excessive value on uniformity for its own sake. Results mattered. The path to results could vary. Among the technical distinctions of the Iron Warriors, their gene seed is notable for a purity that, in the context of the wider Legiones Astartes, stands out as exceptional. The genetic material from which new Iron Warriors were created showed a remarkably low rate of mutation or degradation, producing new recruits whose enhanced physiologies matched closely and consistently the intended design. This was not an accident. Perturabo's analytical attention extended to every aspect of his legion's operation, including the biological, and he applied the same rigor to questions of genetic quality that he applied to questions of fortification design. Standards were maintained with precision. Selection and implantation procedures were followed with a consistency that left little room for the kind of gradual drift that affected some other legions. For Perturabo, gene seed purity was a form of engineering quality control. A space marine whose enhancements had expressed cleanly and completely was a more reliable instrument than one whose biology had taken unpredicted paths. Reliability, in all things, was a value he placed extremely high. There is also, perhaps, something more personal in this attention to genetic integrity. A Primarch who found the world around him perpetually, fractionally wrong might be expected to care deeply about maintaining at least this one domain in a state of correctness. And yet, for all the purity of their gene seed in most respects, the Iron Warriors carried within their genetic inheritance a characteristic that complicated the usual picture: an unusual and pronounced resistance to radiation. This sounds, on the surface, like an advantage, and in purely practical terms, it was one. The environments in which the Iron Warriors most often operated, besieged industrial complexes, shattered cityscapes, worlds where the infrastructure of civilization had been damaged or destroyed, were frequently environments where radiation exposure was a genuine operational hazard. The Iron Warriors could work in these conditions with a tolerance that other legions lacked. But the radiation resistance came with its own biological consequences, and those consequences were not entirely benign. The same genetic trait that protected the Legion from external radiation appears to have influenced their neurological makeup in ways that contributed to a particular psychological character, a tendency toward endurance at the expense of other qualities, a hardness of effect, a reduced capacity for the kind of emotional flexibility that makes adaptation easier. Whether this is truly a genetic flaw or simply a trade-off that the Legion's operational role made acceptable is a matter of perspective. Perturabo himself, characteristically, seems to have viewed it with clear eyes, acknowledging it as a limitation while regarding any attempt to sentimentalize around it as a waste of time. War, in the popular imagination, is about moments of heroism, the charge, the duel, the pivotal decision in the heat of battle. In reality, as anyone who has studied military history in depth will tell you, war is primarily about logistics. About whether the right equipment arrives at the right place at the right time. About whether the army that fights on Tuesday was fed and rested on Monday. About the 10,000 invisible processes of supply, maintenance, communication, and coordination that determine whether any of the dramatic moments ever get the chance to occur. Perturabo understood this with a completeness that was, even among Primarchs, exceptional. His logistical mind operated on the same level as his engineering mind, totalistic, precise, capable of holding enormous complexity in simultaneous view. He could plan a campaign not just in terms of its tactical phases but in terms of its full logistical architecture, calculating supply requirements, transit times, maintenance schedules, reserve allocations, with a speed and accuracy that his staff officers found almost incomprehensible. This mastery meant that the Iron Warriors could sustain operations in conditions and for durations that would have ground other forces to a halt. Their sieges did not stall for want of ammunition or equipment. Their campaigns did not collapse because someone had miscalculated how much a legion eats in a week. The mundane infrastructure of war was, for Perturabo, as interesting and as important as its dramatic surface. How you win matters less than whether you win. This, reduced to its essentials, was the victory philosophy of Perturabo and the Iron Warriors, and it placed them in sharp contrast to several of their brother legions, who pursued particular styles of victory with an almost aesthetic commitment. The Iron Warriors did not care about elegant victories. They did not seek to win quickly if winning slowly was more certain. They did not seek to win heroically if winning methodically was more reliable. They sought outcomes, the reduction of the enemy's capacity to resist, the achievement of the campaign's objectives, and they pursued those outcomes by whatever path the analysis indicated was most likely to succeed. This philosophy expressed itself most visibly in their approach to siege warfare. Other legions might seek the dramatic breakthrough, the assault that ended a siege in a single decisive action. The Iron Warriors were as willing to settle in for a grinding attritional reduction of a fortified position that might take months. Not because they lacked the capability for decisive action, but because they refused to allow pride or aesthetics to override the cold calculation of what would actually work. In an imperium that was, at its heart, a military enterprise of almost incomprehensible scale, this philosophy was not merely pragmatic. It was, arguably, exactly what was needed. Within the Iron Warriors, certain phrases and formulations achieved a status beyond that of mere slogans or battle cries. They became structural elements of the Legion's psychological architecture. The Unbreakable Litany was among the most significant of these. Repeated in training, before battle, during the most punishing phases of a siege, it served as a means of anchoring the individual warrior's will to the collective identity of the Legion at precisely those moments when individual will was most at risk of failing. The content of the litany was consistent with the Legion's broader doctrine. It spoke of endurance, of the irrelevance of suffering when set against the requirements of duty, of the body as an instrument that could be pushed further than it believed itself capable of going. It was, in essence, a technique for overriding the self-preserving instincts that even transhuman warriors are not entirely free of. There is something to admire in this, a legion that prepared itself so thoroughly for suffering that suffering lost its power to stop them. But there is also something sobering about it. The Unbreakable Litany did not ask warriors to transcend pain. It asked them to disregard it, to treat their own well-being as irrelevant to the calculation of what they were required to do. In the long history of the Iron Warriors, this attitude would prove both their greatest strength and a contributor to their eventual darkness. Before a legion can be reshaped, it must first be assessed, and before it can be assessed, it must be tested. When Perturabo took command of the 4th Legion, one of his earliest priorities was to understand precisely what he was working with. Not the official accounts of the Legion's performance, not the summary reports, but the actual, observed reality of how his warriors behaved under conditions that left no room for presentation or performance. Justice Rock was this test. The details of the engagement vary across sources, but the essential structure is consistent. The Legion was given an objective that was, by ordinary military calculation, extremely demanding, the kind of assault that would strip away any false confidence and reveal the true character of those involved. Perturabo watched. He assessed. He noted everything, the decisions made under pressure, the points at which organization held and the points at which it frayed, the individual warriors who exceeded expectations and those who did not. What he found was a legion with significant capability but equally significant problems, a formation that had developed habits and assumptions that would need to be broken before they could be replaced with something better. Justice Rock was not a victory so much as a diagnosis. And once Perturabo had his diagnosis, he began the treatment with characteristic thoroughness. There are campaigns in the history of the Great Crusade that are celebrated, that appear in the official histories as examples of the Imperium at its most glorious, worlds welcomed into the light, civilizations given the gift of unity. And then there are campaigns that are recorded in the dry language of administrative completion, where the word purge does a great deal of work, and where the details, when they can be found at all, are not the kind that inspire celebration. The Meritara Cluster Purge was the latter. A series of worlds within a defined stellar region, assessed as non-compliant or hostile to compliance, subjected to the full weight of the Iron Warrior's capacity for systematic reduction. What this meant in practice was the application of Perturabo's doctrines in their most unsparing form, not the dramatic assault, not the swift liberation, but the methodical, comprehensive destruction of the enemy's ability to resist, pursued through whatever means were necessary and for as long as it took. The purge established the Iron Warrior's reputation for a particular kind of warfare, not glorious, not celebrated, but absolutely effective. Worlds that were assigned to Perturabo's legion did not remain non-compliant. They could not. He simply had no mechanism within his operational philosophy for stopping short of complete success. The galaxy was being ordered, and ordering it sometimes required methods that the official histories preferred not to dwell upon. Within the Iron Warriors, not all knowledge was shared equally. There existed, beneath the visible hierarchy of the Legion, a stratum of understanding that was accessible only to a specific group, the Black Judges. This inner circle was not defined by rank alone, though rank was a prerequisite. It was defined by clearance, by the determination, presumably made by Perturabo himself, that certain individuals could be trusted with certain categories of information that were not available to the Legion at large. What the Black Judges knew, precisely, is difficult to establish from the historical record, by design one suspects. What can be inferred from context is that they served as an intelligence and oversight function within the Legion, privy to information about the Legion's own operations, its internal politics, and possibly its Primarch's longer-term intentions, that was deliberately withheld from the wider body. In a Legion built on the doctrine of iron discipline and collective endurance, the existence of a group with privileged knowledge is interesting. It suggests that Perturabo, for all his apparent commitment to ruthless transparency about standards and consequences, understood that there were things which could not be shared with everyone without cost, and that he was willing to construct the same kind of layered compartmentalized information architecture in his Legion that he constructed in his fortifications. A Primarch's armor is never merely armor. It is a statement, a technology, a personal mythology rendered in ceramite and adamantium. And for Perturabo, whose relationship with craftsmanship and engineering was as intimate as any other aspect of his character, his warplate was a subject of considerable personal investment. Over the course of his career, he maintained and developed an arsenal of armored configurations suited to different operational requirements, not a single suit worn for symbolic consistency, but a practical collection of options, each optimized for a specific range of tactical circumstances. Heavy configurations for the most dangerous assault environments. Configurations optimized for command functions, incorporating enhanced communications and sensor arrays. Options that prioritize specific resistance profiles based on the anticipated nature of enemy fire. This approach reflected, again, the engineering mind, the refusal to accept a single solution where multiple solutions, appropriately selected, would each perform better within their designated parameters. For Perturabo, the question was never, what is the best armor, but what is the best armor for this specific situation, a distinction that sounds subtle but reflects a fundamentally different relationship with the concept of equipment, one that treats every instrument as a tool whose value is always relative to the task at hand. Among the more technically sophisticated elements of Perturabo's personal arsenal was a suit that went beyond the conventional parameters of even Primarch grade power armor, the logos. This was not simply heavier armor or more refined armor, though it was both of those things. It incorporated technological elements that Perturabo had developed or refined himself, pushing the boundaries of what standard mechanicum construction could produce. The logos represented, in material form, the intersection of Perturabo's engineering intellect and his personal experience of warfare, every feature of its design informed by decades of combat observation, every system chosen because analysis had identified it as optimal for the specific demands of the environments in which he most often operated. Details of its construction remain partially obscure. Some elements appear to draw on technological principles that were not standard across the Legiones Astartes, and there are suggestions that certain components incorporated insights from Perturabo's own theoretical work in areas that touched on unconventional physics. Whether the logos was the finest suit of armor produced during the Great Crusade is a question that admits of no easy answer. What seems clear is that it was among the most thoroughly considered, designed not to be impressive, but to work. Perturabo's engineering interests were not confined to the macroscopic, to walls and ramparts and siege engines and the gross mechanics of force and resistance. He was equally interested in effects that operated below the threshold of ordinary perception. His work on subsonic engineering, the application of low-frequency sound waves as a tool in siege and military contexts, represents one of the more unusual threads in his long career of innovation. The principle involved was not new in itself. The effect of low-frequency vibration on physical structures had been understood, in broad terms, for centuries. What Perturabo brought to it was his characteristic analytical rigor, the precise calculation of what frequencies, at what intensities, directed at what specific architectural configurations, would produce effects that crossed the threshold from inconvenience to structural relevance. He worked out the mathematics of resonance with the same thoroughness he brought to ballistic calculations, identifying the specific vulnerabilities of different construction materials and methods to different frequency profiles. The practical applications were various: disorientation of defenders, structural fatigue in targeted fortifications, interference with equipment sensitive to vibration. In combination with more conventional siege methods, subsonic effects could degrade a defensive position in ways that were difficult for the defenders to identify and counter. It was, in other words, exactly the kind of tool that Perturabo found most satisfying, one that worked on the enemy without the enemy fully understanding how. There are weapons of war, and then there are weapons of war that reshape the entire tactical landscape in which they are deployed. The Tyrant Siege Terminator pattern was the latter. Developed under Perturabo's direct supervision, and in significant measure from his own design work, It represented a configuration of Terminator armor optimized specifically for the assault phase of siege warfare. Standard Terminator armor was designed for extreme durability in close-quarters fighting, and in this function it was already exceptional. The Tyrant pattern retained this durability while incorporating modifications that addressed the specific challenges of fighting through a breached fortification, moving through rubble and debris, engaging in the confined spaces of underground complexes and bunker networks, maintaining offensive capability in the chaotic close-range environment that follows the successful reduction of a defensive perimeter. The weapon systems integrated into the Tyrant configuration were selected and refined, with the same analytical attention to operational requirements that characterized all of Perturabo's engineering work. Nothing was included because it was impressive. Everything was included because analysis indicated that it would improve the probability of the warrior wearing it, surviving long enough to complete their objective. In the hands of Iron Warrior's assault teams, the Tyrant pattern Terminator became one of the more feared instruments of the Great Crusade's final phase. The Iron Circle were, by any assessment, among the most remarkable constructions of the Great Crusade era, and they were Perturabos. A cohort of Domitor-class battle automata, rebuilt and extensively modified from standard Mechanicum configurations, they served as the Primarch's personal guard. What made the Iron Circle distinctive was not simply their individual combat capability, formidable as that was, but the degree to which Perturabo had personalized and enhanced each unit, integrating his own engineering innovations into their systems, refining their combat protocols, improving the coordination between individual automata in a way that made the Circle function as something more than the sum of its parts. There is something revealing about the choice to use automata rather than warriors as a personal guard. Other Primarchs surrounded themselves with their finest soldiers, with living warriors whose presence signaled the depth of the bond between a commander and his legion. Perturabo chose machines. Machines that would not feel resentment. Machines that would not need to be managed, motivated, or trusted in the way that living guards needed to be trusted. Machines whose loyalty was structural rather than conditional. Whether this represents a pragmatic engineering preference, a profound pessimism about the reliability of people, or some combination of both, the choice says something significant about the Primarch who made it. In the long catalogue of Perturabo's accomplishments, the sieges won, the fortifications built, the campaigns concluded in imperial victory, there runs a thread that is sometimes overlooked in the focus on his military career. He was, in the most complete sense of the word, an inventor. Not a specialist, not a man who had identified one area of technical inquiry and pursued it with narrowing focus, but a genuine polymath whose innovations ranged across disciplines with an ease that most specialists found bewildering. In the course of a single decade, he might develop new approaches to materials science, refine the targeting systems of siege artillery, contribute theoretical work to the physics of structural resonance, design a new class of combat automata, and advance the understanding of anti-warp architectural principles. Each of these would have represented a career's work for an ordinary mind. For Perturabo, they were simply the natural output of an intelligence that could not help but find solutions to problems wherever it turned its attention. The tragedy embedded in this extraordinary productivity is that almost none of it brought him satisfaction. Each invention solved the problem it was designed to solve, and in solving it, ceased to interest him. The next problem was always waiting. The restlessness was total and permanent. He was perhaps the most prolific inventor in the Legiones Astartes, and perhaps also the least content with anything he had made. The bitterness takes root. The Great Crusade was, in its official telling, a story of illumination, the light of the Imperium spreading outward across the darkness of a galaxy that had forgotten what unity looked like. It was a story of reunion and restoration, of humanity reclaiming its birthright among the stars. And for some legions, this telling was reasonably accurate. They fought the kinds of battles that made for inspiring records, open engagements, dramatic victories, the liberation of worlds that welcomed their arrival. The Iron Warriors fought a different kind of war. Again and again, across decade after decade of the Crusade, they were assigned the sieges. Not the glorious ones, not the legendary assaults against impossible odds that became the centerpieces of imperial history, but the grinding, attritional, unglamorous reduction of fortified positions that had to be taken because the Crusade could not move forward while they held. Void stations riddled with defenders. Underground complexes kilometers deep. Hive cities that had been fortifying themselves against attack for centuries. The work that no one wanted to do, that left no room for heroism or spectacle, that was simply hard and bloody and slow and necessary. The Iron Warriors did it, campaign after campaign, and they did it better than anyone else. And the Crusade moved forward, and the histories were written, and the Iron Warriors were given the next siege. There is a number that follows the Iron Warriors through the historical record of the Great Crusade, and it is not a comfortable one. Of all the Space Marine legions committed to the longest and most demanding phases of the Crusade, the 4th Legion suffered the highest rates of sustained attrition. Not the most dramatic single engagement losses, not the catastrophic battles that reduced a legion in a day, but the slow, cumulative bleeding of warriors lost in ones and tens and hundreds across thousands of sieges conducted across centuries. This was, in a very direct sense, the cost of the role they had been assigned. Siege warfare kills defenders efficiently, but it also kills attackers. It places assault troops in the most dangerous possible positions, exposed, channeled, unable to use speed or maneuver to reduce their vulnerability, and asks them to advance anyway. The Iron Warriors did this repeatedly, at a tempo and a scale that no other legion matched, and the casualty figures reflected it with merciless honesty. Replacement rates struggled to keep pace. Experienced warriors were lost and replaced with recruits who then became experienced by surviving long enough to do so. It was a cycle that ground on for the full length of the Crusade, and it was a cycle that Perturabo was fully aware of, in every detail, at every stage. He asked it of his legion anyway, because the Crusade required it. And the legion gave it, because iron within, iron without left no acknowledged alternative. If you wanted to design a moment calculated to cause maximum damage to Perturabo's relationship with the Emperor, it would be difficult to improve upon what actually happened. The Imperial Palace, the most significant fortification in human history, the seat of the Imperium itself, the architectural and symbolic heart of everything the Great Crusade had been building toward, required a Space Marine Primarch to oversee its design and construction. And the Emperor gave the commission to Rogel Dorn. To understand why this was so devastating, you have to understand what it meant to Perturabo. Fortification was not merely his profession, it was the domain in which he expressed everything that could not find expression elsewhere. His art, his philosophy, his intellect at its fullest stretch. He was, by any objective assessment, the finest siege engineer and fortification designer in the Imperium. And the most important fortification in the Imperium was given to someone else. Whether the Emperor made this decision carelessly, or for reasons of logistics and availability, or because he understood Dorn better and trusted him more, or for some purpose that neither Perturabo nor history has been able to fully decode, none of that changes what Perturabo received from it. He received the message, accurate or not, that his best was not wanted where it mattered most. That the thing he was best at in all the galaxy was not, in the Emperor's estimation, good enough for the Emperor's house. Rogel Dorn and Perturabo were, in certain technical respects, opposites, and yet they were also, in ways that perhaps neither fully acknowledged, mirrors of each other. Both were fortification specialists. Both built their identities around the making and breaking of defenses. Both were deeply serious men, not given to the theatrical performances that characterized some of their brothers. And yet the philosophies that underpinned their shared field were fundamentally incompatible. Dorn believed in the perfect defense, the fortress held at all costs, the wall that did not yield, the refusal of ground as a matter of principle as much as tactics. Perturabo believed that any defense could be broken, given sufficient analysis and time, and that the proper response to this truth was not denial but rigorous understanding. He could look at Dorn's finest work and see, with his analytical precision, exactly how he would take it apart. Whether he was right to feel this way, whether his assessment of Dorn's work was accurate or shaded by envy, is genuinely difficult to disentangle. What is clear is that the rivalry went deep, far below the surface of professional disagreement into something personal and structural. Dorn had something Perturabo wanted. And Perturabo, who forgot nothing and saw everything, could never quite set that knowledge down. Perturabo did not resent Horus for his battlefield ability. He might have disagreed with specific tactical choices, might have assessed particular decisions as suboptimal, but Horus was a genuinely gifted commander, and Perturabo's analytical mind did not distort that fact. What he resented, with a depth and consistency that runs through accounts of their relationship, was something less tangible and more corrosive: Horus's charisma. The ease with which Horus moved through the social architecture of the Crusade. The way that loyalty flowed toward him naturally, as water flows downhill, without apparent effort or calculation. The way that warriors who served alongside him would speak of him afterward in tones that suggested something close to devotion. Perturabo had never experienced this. He commanded respect, fear, even, but not the effortless affection that Horus seemed to generate simply by being present. He had spent his life surrounded by people who valued his capabilities while maintaining a careful distance from his person, and he had watched Horus receive, apparently without effort, the thing that all his capability could not purchase. This is a particular kind of pain, not the pain of being surpassed in your own field, but the pain of watching someone else be loved in ways you have concluded, perhaps too early and too finally, are simply not available to you. Of all Perturabo's brothers, Mortarion of the Death Guard was in many ways his closest structural parallel, another Primarch who had grown up in darkness, who had built his identity around endurance and suffering, who had no patience for glamour or theatrics, and who viewed the more celebrated legions with a skepticism that occasionally shaded into contempt. You might expect these two to have found common ground in their shared austerity, their shared distance from the warmer registers of the Primarch fraternity. Instead, what developed between them was a friction born precisely from that similarity. Mortarion had a philosophy of suffering that was, in some sense, even more absolute than Perturabo's, a belief that exposure to the worst that the world could offer was itself a form of purification, that to be hardened was to be elevated. He looked at Perturabo's analytical approach to warfare, the engineering, the calculation, the refusal to commit warriors to positions that analysis had not already prepared, and found in it something that fell short of his standard. Where Mortarion valued the willingness to simply endure, Perturabo valued the intelligence to make endurance unnecessary where possible. It was a real philosophical disagreement, not merely a personality clash. And it was one that neither man had the temperament to navigate with much grace. In the long and largely melancholy account of Perturabo's relationships with his brothers, there is one that stands apart, one that seems to have offered him something genuinely different from the calculation, competition, and distance that characterized most of the others. Magnus the Red, Primarch of the Thousand Suns, was in almost every superficial respect Perturabo's opposite. Where Perturabo was material, Magnus was metaphysical. Where Perturabo built walls against the warp, Magnus swam in it. Where Perturabo expressed his genius in iron and stone, Magnus expressed his in light and thought and the impossible geometries of psychic space. And yet something in this contrast seems to have worked, rather than grating. Magnus was one of the few beings in the galaxy whose mind moved at a speed and depth that Perturabo could recognize as comparable to his own. Their conversations, by the accounts of those who witnessed them, operated at a level that most observers could follow only in fragments. They debated, disagreed, challenged each other's fundamental premises with a rigor that both seemed to find genuinely satisfying. For Perturabo, who had spent his entire life intellectually alone in a crowd, this may have been one of the rarest experiences available to him, the experience of being, for once, genuinely met. The Sactrada Deeps campaign is not among the most famous engagements of the Great Crusade, and in the official histories it receives little more than a mention. But in the context of understanding Perturabo, it is significant, one of the clearer documented instances of the rage that lay beneath the iron discipline, breaking through in ways that even he could not entirely contain or direct. The Deeps presented a particular kind of hell, an underground complex of extraordinary depth and complexity, honeycombed with defensive positions, where the Iron Warriors were asked to fight in conditions that maximized casualties and minimized the advantages that Perturabo's engineering expertise could provide. The campaign ground on, and the casualties mounted, and the ledger of Iron Warriors dead grew longer with each phase of the assault. What followed, when the position finally fell, was not the measured completion of a military objective. It was something rawer than that, a violence that exceeded what the situation strictly required, driven by an anger that had been building across the full terrible length of the campaign. The fury at Sactrada was the fury of a man who had given everything, who had watched his warriors die in their hundreds, and who had received nothing in return but the expectation that he would proceed to the next assignment and give everything again. Of all the campaigns that the Iron Warriors fought during the Great Crusade, the war against the Rud is perhaps the most uniquely horrifying, and not because of conventional military losses. The Rud are among the most alien of the xeno-species encountered during the Crusade, and their most terrible characteristic is not martial. It is temporal. In the presence of sufficient numbers of Rud, time itself becomes distorted, entropy accelerates in the surrounding area, and living things age at rates that bear no relationship to the passage of time as ordinarily understood. Warriors who spent too long in proximity to large Rud populations aged years in hours. The physical consequences were catastrophic: degeneration, decay, death, the body consuming itself in fast forward. The Iron Warriors fought this enemy, and the Iron Warriors paid this price. Warriors who had survived decades of conventional warfare aged to death in the course of a single engagement. The legion that had already suffered the highest attrition rates in the Crusade was asked to absorb losses of a kind that no amount of iron discipline had prepared them for, losses that were not the clean death of battle but something slower and stranger and, in their way, more terrible. Perturabo watched warriors he had commanded for decades wither and die from accelerated time, and he could do nothing to engineer a solution, because the problem was not structural. It was temporal, and temporal problems do not yield to siege mathematics. At some point, the precise timing is debated, but the fact itself is documented. Perturabo went to the emperor. Not in the metaphorical sense of submitting a report through the appropriate channels, but in the most direct sense available to him. He petitioned the master of mankind directly, seeking acknowledgement of what the Iron Warriors had given to the Crusade, seeking some recognition of the cost they had paid and the burden they had carried, seeking, perhaps, reassurance that the silence and the expendability and the endless dirty sieges were not all that the emperor saw when he looked at the Fourth Legion. What he received was silence. Whether the emperor was genuinely unavailable, or whether the silence was a deliberate response, or whether something was communicated that Perturabo interpreted as silence when it was intended as something else, history does not resolve this cleanly. What matters is what Perturabo took from it. He had asked, directly and with whatever remained of his capacity for trust, and the answer had been nothing. For a man who never forgot anything, who perceived the truth beneath every performance, who had spent decades watching the Crusade distribute its glories unevenly while the Iron Warriors paid its costs, this silence was not ambiguous. It was confirmation. It was the final piece of evidence in a case he had been building, against his will, for a very long time. The doctrine of iron within, iron without was designed to produce endurance. And it succeeded, perhaps too completely. What emerged in the Iron Warriors, over the long decades of the Crusade, was something that went beyond the intended fortification of the will. A psychological condition that scholars have since termed iron within syndrome, for want of a more precise clinical designation, in which the suppression of weakness, practiced long enough and thoroughly enough, becomes indistinguishable from the suppression of everything else. The Legion had been trained to wall off pain, to treat suffering as irrelevant, to deny any internal experience that might interfere with the performance of duty. In the short term, this made them extraordinarily effective. In the long term, it produced warriors whose emotional architecture had been so thoroughly fortified that the qualities which made fortification necessary, the capacity for fear, for grief, for hope, had been buried so deep that they could no longer be accessed in any healthy form. What remained was endurance stripped of purpose, strength without warmth, the capacity to go on, in the absence of any clear reason why going on was worth doing. The Iron Warriors became, in some measure, prisoners of their own doctrine, locked inside armor so perfect that it had no door. While Perturabo and the Iron Warriors bled across the galaxy in the Emperor's service, Olympia, the world that had shaped him, the home he had left behind, was not unchanged by his absence. The city-states he had grown up among, the political structures he had known, were never entirely stable, and the decades during which the Iron Warriors' attention was fixed entirely on the demands of the Great Crusade were decades in which the tensions inherent in Olympia's political architecture had time to develop without correction. Unrest grew. Old grievances between the tyrant-ruled city-states found new expression. The authority of the Imperium, in a world so far from the front lines of the Crusade's advance, was abstract in a way that made it easier to resist or resent. Those who had known Perturabo as a young man, who had lived in the shadow of his departure and his legend, nursed their own complicated feelings about the world he had chosen over them. The unrest had been building for years before it finally crossed the threshold from political tension into something that required a response. And when it did, the Iron Warriors were the response. Perturabo turned from the endless sieges of the Great Crusade toward the world that had made him, and what happened next would mark the Iron Warriors in ways from which they would never fully recover. Olympia burns, the point of no return. There is a word that the histories use for what happened to Olympia, and that word is compliance. It is a clean word, an administrative word, a word that belongs to the language of empire building rather than the language of tragedy. It does not adequately describe what occurred. When the unrest on Olympia finally reached the point at which the Imperium, at which Perturabo, could no longer treat it as a background condition to be managed from a distance, the Iron Warriors came home. And they brought with them everything they had learned across decades of siege warfare conducted on worlds that meant nothing to them personally. The result was not a police action. It was not a measured restoration of order. It was the application of the Iron Warriors' full capacity for systematic violence to a population that included people Perturabo had grown up among, streets he had walked, buildings he had studied, the stone and iron of a world that had shaped him at the most fundamental level. The compliance of Olympia was, by the standards of the Great Crusade, not unusual in its methods. What made it different was who was conducting it, and against whom. Perturabo processed it, as he processed everything, through the machinery of his analytical mind. He completed the objective. He restored order. And something in him, in the completing of it, broke in a way that even his eidetic memory and his iron doctrine could not fully account for or contain. In the accounting of what the compliance of Olympia cost Perturabo, the military losses and the psychological weight of turning his legion against his homeworld are significant. But they are not the deepest cost. The deepest cost had a name. Calophone, the daughter of Damocles, the one genuine warmth of his early life, the person who had known him as a person rather than as an asset or a phenomenon, did not survive the compliance. The details of her death vary across the sources that record it, and it is possible that Perturabo himself never had complete clarity on exactly how it happened, in the chaos and violence of a world being brought back under imperial authority by force. What is consistent across the accounts is the fact of it: she was gone. The one relationship from his early life that had seemed to exist outside the usual transactions of power, the one person who had offered him the experience of being known rather than appraised, had been taken by the very operation he had conducted. Whether she died in the fighting, or in circumstances adjacent to it, the loss landed on Perturabo with a weight that his iron doctrine was simply not designed to bear. He had built walls against everything. He had fortified himself against grief and loneliness and the particular pain of being perpetually expendable. But he had not, perhaps could not have, built a wall against this, because to wall against this would have required walling against the last thing in his early life that had been genuinely good. The road to the heresy was not, for most of the Primarchs who walked it, a single dramatic moment of choice. It was a process, a gradual erosion, a slow repositioning of the line between acceptable and unacceptable, a series of small steps each of which seemed to follow reasonably from the last. For Perturabo, the agent of this process was Fulgrim. The Primarch of the Emperor's Children was, by this point in the heresy's unfolding, already deeply compromised, already host to the demon that had taken up residence within him, already operating as an instrument of chaos even as he maintained the surface performance of a brother and a colleague. Fulgrim came to Perturabo in the aftermath of Olympia, in the wreckage of everything that the compliance had cost him, and he spoke to the wound. He did not make crude arguments about betrayal or revenge. He was far too subtle for that, or rather, the thing wearing his face was far too subtle for that. He spoke instead to Perturabo's deepest convictions about what he had been given and what he had been denied. He reflected back, with perfect accuracy and carefully calibrated sympathy, every genuine grievance that the years had accumulated. And in doing so, he made the path that led away from the Emperor seem less like treachery and more like the only honest response to a relationship that had never been honest to begin with. Perturabo was not naive. But grief, and rage, and decades of confirmed suspicion, make even the most analytical mind vulnerable to the argument it most wants to believe. There are weapons, and then there are weapons that carry within them the full weight of the relationships and histories that produced them. Forgebreaker is the latter. A mastercrafted thunder hammer of extraordinary power, it was created by Fulgrim as a gift to Perturabo, or rather, as part of the careful architecture of temptation that Fulgrim was constructing around his brother during the period leading up to the heresy. The gift was not random. It was precisely chosen, a weapon of devastating siege-breaking capability, given to the master of siege warfare, crafted with the kind of artisanal perfection that Perturabo's aesthetic sensibilities could not fail to recognize and appreciate. It was, in its way, a masterpiece, proof that someone had paid close enough attention to Perturabo to understand what would move him. Whether this attention was Fulgrim's own, or the demon's, or some combination, hardly matters in terms of its effect. Perturabo received the hammer and understood that someone had seen him clearly enough to make something this perfectly suited to who he was. In a life defined by the experience of being valued for his utility rather than his personhood, this was significant. The weapon that would become one of the most feared in the heresy was also, in some measure, a love bomb, a precisely engineered act of apparent understanding, offered at the exact moment when Perturabo was most in need of feeling understood. But the story of Forgebreaker does not begin with Fulgrim. It begins with Ferrus Manus, the Iron Hands Primarch, and with a relationship between brothers that represented something genuine in the fraternity of Primarchs. Ferrus Manus and Fulgrim had been among the closest of the Primarch brothers, their bond built on a shared passion for craftsmanship and making, for the beauty of things perfectly constructed. It was in the context of this friendship that Forgebreaker was first created, forged by Fulgrim as a gift to Ferrus, an expression of their bond rendered in the most permanent and skillful form available to him. Ferrus received it, and in return gave Fulgrim Fireblade, the sword he had crafted from the same act of brotherhood. Two weapons, exchanged between brothers, each carrying within it the skill and intention of its maker. And then the heresy came, and Ferrus Manus chose his side without hesitation, and at Istvan V he died, betrayed, as so many were, by brothers he had trusted. Forgebreaker passed from his hands to Fulgrim's, and from Fulgrim's to Perturabo's, transformed in its passage from a symbol of brotherhood into an instrument of seduction. A weapon born from genuine affection, repurposed as a tool of corruption. There is something in this transit that captures something essential about what the heresy did to everything it touched. It would be too simple, and, in its way, too generous to the heresy's architects, to say that Perturabo chose his side freely. The reality is considerably more complicated, and considerably more revealing of the methods Horus was willing to employ to secure the allegiances he needed. Perturabo was not, in the period leading up to the open outbreak of the heresy, an enthusiastic conspirator. He had grievances, real ones, legitimate ones, grievances that any honest assessment of his treatment by the Imperium would have to acknowledge. But grievance is not the same as commitment to a cause, and there is evidence that Perturabo's movement toward Horus's banner was not a willing march but something considerably more coerced. The mechanism of coercion was characteristically ruthless, a threat, implicit or explicit, involving the use of virus weapons, the same terrible instruments of mass biological destruction that had already been deployed at Istvan III. The message, however it was delivered, was clear. The world Perturabo cared about, or the people he was responsible for, or both, could be made to share the fate of Istvan III if the answer was wrong. Horus, who spoke so eloquently about the betrayal of loyalty by those in power, was willing to use the threat of planetary annihilation to purchase the allegiance of his own brother. Perturabo understood this. He understood it completely, with every analytical faculty he possessed. And he complied anyway, because the alternative was a cost he would not pay with other people's lives. The Heresy Unleashed. Istvan V. The name carries a weight in the history of the heresy that few other names can match, a weight not of glory or tragedy in the conventional sense, but of something colder and more deliberate. What happened there was not a battle in any honest meaning of the word. It was an execution, planned with the precision of a siege operation and carried out with the ruthlessness that the architects of the heresy had, by this point, fully committed themselves to. The loyalist legions who made planetfall on Istvan V did so believing they were reinforcing an ongoing operation. What they walked into was a killing ground. The traitor legions who had feigned alliance until the moment of betrayal turned on them from behind, and from above came the virus bombs, weapons of such indiscriminate and total lethality that their use represents one of the most absolute transgressions in the history of the heresy. For Perturabo, who had been coerced into his allegiance and who had no illusions about the nature of what he was now part of, Istvan V was a kind of confirmation. This was the character of the enterprise he had been pressed into. This was what Horus's rebellion looked like when it set aside its justifications and showed its actual face. He processed it, as he processed everything, with analytical completeness. He filed it in the perfect archive of his memory, alongside everything else that had been done to him and around him and in his name. And he continued, because there was no longer anywhere else to go. In the vast and terrible catalogue of the heresy's atrocities, the Ruined Storm occupies a unique position, not as a military action or a political betrayal, but as something that operated on a cosmological scale. A warp phenomenon of unprecedented magnitude, deliberately cultivated and unleashed, it tore the galaxy apart along a line that divided the Imperium into isolated halves, severing communication and transit across an enormous region of space and making coherent Imperial response to the heresy immeasurably more difficult. Moving through the ruined storm was not simply dangerous. For most navigators and most vessels, it was essentially impossible, a wall of warp violence that defied conventional navigation techniques entirely. Perturabo navigated it. Whether through his analytical understanding of warp phenomena, his years of theoretical work on the relationship between the immaterial and the material, or some application of the unsettling warp-adjacent perception that had troubled him since his earliest years, he developed an approach to moving through the ruined storm that was, if not safe, at least survivable. That he was able to do this at all speaks to the depth of his understanding of a domain that most of his brothers, and most navigators, could only treat as an impassable obstacle. It also speaks to something else, that the walls he had spent years trying to build against the warp had, in their construction, required him to understand it more thoroughly than almost anyone alive. The Fall system engagement is one of the more strategically complex actions of the heresy period, and Perturabo's role in it illustrates the degree to which he had become, whatever his personal reservations about the Enterprise, an enormously effective instrument of Horus's campaign. The Iron Warriors under his command executed an operation at Fall that combined the siege mentality with void warfare in ways that demonstrated the adaptability of the Legion's core doctrines beyond their most obvious applications. But it is not the initial engagement that most rewards attention, it is the aftermath. The trap that was set at Fall, and the strategic consequences that flowed from it, played out across a time frame that exceeded the duration of most of the heresy's other major engagements. The grinding, attritional approach that the Iron Warriors applied to fortress walls was applied here to a strategic situation, a patient, methodical containment that denied the enemy options over an extended period rather than seeking the dramatic resolution of a single decisive action. 900 years is a number that requires a moment of stillness to properly absorb. In the context of the Iron Warriors' history, it is both extraordinary and, in its way, characteristic, the Legion of Endurance, enduring. To speak of the Fall system in terms of its strategic dimensions is one thing. To speak of what it cost the warriors who lived through it is another. The endurance demanded of the Iron Warriors at Fall was not the endurance of a single brutal campaign with a defined end point. It was the endurance of sustained operations across a time frame that tested the Legion's psychological and physical resources in ways that conventional military planning is not designed to accommodate. Space Marines are not immortal, but they are extraordinarily long-lived and durable, and the Iron Warriors are among the most durable of them, their genetic heritage and their doctrine combining to produce warriors capable of sustaining function under conditions that would destroy ordinary soldiers. At Fall, these qualities were tested to limits that even the Legion's most demanding previous experiences had not approached. The unbreakable litany was not merely recited here, it was lived, in the most complete and demanding sense possible. Warriors who had already given more than most beings in the galaxy could be asked to give were required to give more still, because the operation required it, and because iron within, iron without, left no acknowledged alternative. What emerged on the other side of Fall was a legion that had proven, beyond any further question, the absolute limits of what they were capable of enduring. It was a proof that brought them no comfort. As the heresy moved toward its culmination, as Horus's forces drove toward Terra itself and the final confrontation that would determine the fate of the Imperium, Perturabo's role expanded in scope to match the scale of the moment. The Solar War, the campaign to breach the defenses of Sol itself and bring the traitor fleet within striking distance of Terra, required command at the highest level, and Perturabo was given it. The assignment was both an acknowledgement of his capability and a reflection of the specific demands of the task. Breaking the defenses of Sol was, in its essential structure, a siege problem, the largest and most consequential siege problem in human history, but a siege problem nonetheless. The orbital platforms, the defensive networks, the layered fortifications of the Sol system had been designed with extraordinary care, and breaching them required exactly the kind of systematic, analytical approach that Perturabo had spent his entire life developing. He brought to the solar war the same methodology he had brought to every fortified position he had ever faced: the exhaustive analysis, the identification of vulnerabilities, the patient construction of an approach that would succeed not through dramatic action but through the relentless application of calculated pressure. That he did this in service of an enterprise he had never freely chosen, against an Imperium that had treated him with consistent disregard, is one of the quieter tragedies of the heresy. The reduction of the Sol system's outer defenses was not a single engagement but a campaign within a campaign, a series of interconnected operations that peeled away the layers of Imperial defense one by one, each success creating the conditions for the next. The capture of the Uranus and Jupiter spheres, the defensive networks and installations clustered around these outer planets, represented two of the most significant of these incremental victories. Each sphere was a formidable obstacle in its own right, incorporating orbital platforms, void stations, and defensive installations that had been hardened against exactly the kind of assault that the traitor fleet was bringing to bear. Perturabo approached each in the manner of a fortification problem, identifying the specific vulnerabilities that analysis revealed and constructing operational plans that exploited them with minimum wasted effort. The captures were not swift or bloodless. They were grinding, costly, and methodical, which is to say, they were entirely characteristic of how Perturabo waged war. Each one brought the traitor fleet closer to terror, tightening the noose around the Imperium's heart with the same patient, inexorable pressure that the Iron Warriors had applied to siege lines across 100 worlds. The precision of the campaign was, in purely technical terms, remarkable. That it was being used to destroy rather than defend was a distinction that the mathematics did not acknowledge. A Primarch's flagship is, in some respects, the most complete expression of his character available to the historian, more revealing, in certain ways, than his armor or his weapons, because a flagship is a world unto itself, a constructed environment that reflects the values and priorities of the mind that shaped it. The Iron Blood, Perturabo's flagship, was not a vessel that announced itself through elegance or spectacle. It was massive, one of the largest vessels in the traitor fleet, and it was functional in the way that all of Perturabo's constructions were functional, built to do what it was built to do with maximum efficiency and minimum unnecessary elaboration. Its interior was characteristic of its owner, ordered, analytical, designed around the requirements of command and engineering rather than around comfort or display. The spaces in which Perturabo worked were occupied by the instruments of his craft, tactical displays, engineering schematics, the equipment of a mind that was always working on several problems simultaneously. The Iron Blood was not a comfortable ship to visit if you were not there for a specific operational purpose. It was not designed to make visitors feel welcome. It was designed to give its master everything he needed to prosecute the war he was fighting. In this, as in most things, the Iron Blood succeeded completely. Among the traitor Primarchs who served under Horus's banner, Perturabo commanded the largest single fleet concentration during the critical phases of the drive on Terra. This was not an accident or a reflection of favoritism, it was the operational logic of the solar war asserting itself. The campaign required a commander capable of managing void warfare at a scale and complexity that exceeded anything previously attempted, and in the traitor camp, there was no other Primarch whose combination of logistical mastery, analytical capability, and engineering expertise made them as suited to the role. To command a fleet of this size is not merely a question of tactical ability. It is a question of organizational intelligence, the capacity to hold in mind simultaneously the positions, capabilities, supply states, and operational roles of an almost incomprehensible number of individual vessels and their crews, and to direct them in a coordinated fashion toward a common objective. Perturabo did this with the same comprehensive precision he brought to every domain. His staff worked at a pace dictated by a mind that processed information faster than most command structures were designed to accommodate. The fleet moved as a coherent instrument, not as a collection of individual actions. For the defenders of Sol, this coordination was among the most dangerous things about the assault they were facing, the sense that it was all, somehow, accounted for. If the Solar War had a shadow conflict running beneath its military surface, it was the one being fought between Perturabo and Rogel Dorn. The two Primarchs had spent decades as rivals, professional rivals, philosophical rivals, rivals in the specific domain of fortification and siege that both had made their life's work. Now they were on opposite sides of the most consequential conflict in human history, and the nature of that conflict placed them in direct professional opposition, one besieging the greatest fortress ever built, the other defending it. The military dimensions of this confrontation are significant in their own right. But Perturabo did not fight only on the military dimension. He understood Dorn, understood him with the analytical thoroughness he applied to everything, and he used that understanding as a weapon. Decisions were made, feints were executed, pressure was applied in configurations calculated not merely to achieve tactical objectives but to force Dorn into positions that would cost him something beyond ground. To make him doubt. To make him react rather than act. To exploit the philosophical rigidity that Perturabo had identified, years before, as the structural weakness in his brother's otherwise formidable defensive mind. Whether these psychological dimensions of the campaign were decisive is difficult to establish. What is clear is that Perturabo was fighting on every level available to him, and that the personal history between them gave him a weapon that no other attacker could have wielded. The siege of Hydrocaudatus is significant in the history of the Iron Warriors for reasons that extend beyond its immediate military dimensions. The fortress world represented a specific operational objective within the broader strategic context of the Heresy period, and its reduction was prosecuted with the full weight of Perturabo's siege methodology. But it is also significant for what it reveals about the Iron Warriors' relationship with Chaos, and specifically with Chaos Space Marines operating alongside them. The complexities of fighting alongside demonic allies, of managing the relationship between the Iron Warriors' fundamentally analytical and materialist approach to warfare and the irrational, ecstatic violence that Chaos forces embodied, were thrown into sharp relief at Hydrocaudatus. Perturabo had never been comfortable with Chaos, had spent years of his early life trying to build walls against the warp, had approached his own warp sensitivity with analytical discomfort rather than mystical enthusiasm. The heresy had forced him into an alliance with forces that represented everything his instincts rejected. Hydrocaudatus was one of the operational contexts in which this tension became most visible, a siege conducted with Iron Warriors' precision, but in an environment where the rules that governed Iron Warriors' precision were not the only rules in operation. The fortress fell. The cost of its falling was, in some respects, difficult to calculate. The quest for Angel Exterminatus occupies a distinct and deeply strange place in Perturabo's story, distinct because it was one of the rare occasions on which the Primarch pursued an objective that was not primarily military, and strange because of what that objective was. Fulgrim, whose manipulation of Perturabo had been ongoing since the days before the open outbreak of the heresy, led his brother toward the Eye of Terror and toward a prize of immense and terrible significance, a weapon, or a power, or something that the sources describe in terms that resist easy categorization. The Angel Exterminatus, whatever it truly was, represented, in Fulgrim's presentation of it, a means by which Perturabo might transcend the limitations that had defined and constrained him throughout his life. It was, in other words, an offer constructed with full knowledge of its recipient's deepest needs. For a Primarch who had spent centuries building walls against his own limitations, who had perceived with perfect clarity every gap between what he was and what he had the capacity to be, the promise of transcendence was not a simple temptation. It was a precisely targeted one. The quest itself was harrowing, a journey into one of the most dangerous regions in the galaxy, in the company of a being who had long since ceased to be what it appeared. What Perturabo found at its end was not what he had been promised. What he found was a trap, built with understanding of his psychology, sprung at the exact moment of his greatest vulnerability. The betrayal at the heart of the Angel Exterminatus quest was not a sudden revelation, it was the culmination of a manipulation that had been running, with extraordinary patience and precision, since before the heresy began. Fulgrim, or the demon that wore his face, had been working on Perturabo for years. The gift of Forgebreaker. The careful cultivation of sympathy and understanding in the aftermath of Olympia. The steady repositioning of Perturabo's grievances as justifications for a choice that had, in fact, already been made for him. Each step had been designed with full knowledge of its target, which is to say, with full knowledge of a mind analytical enough to see through crude manipulation, and therefore requiring manipulation of extraordinary sophistication. By the time of the Angel Exterminatus, Fulgrim's intentions had become clear enough that Perturabo, with his superhuman perception, should perhaps have seen it sooner. That he did not, or that he saw it and chose not to fully believe it, says something important about what the manipulation had achieved. It had found the gap in Perturabo's otherwise total analytical armor, the need, genuine and long suppressed, to be understood. To be seen. To have someone in the galaxy who cared enough about who he actually was, to pay this quality of attention. That the attention was predatory rather than genuine was, in the end, simply another version of a lesson he had been learning his whole life. In the final terrible days of the Siege of Terra, as the conflict reached its apocalyptic crescendo and the fate of the Imperium balanced on the edge of a blade, Perturabo achieved something that the defenders of Terra had believed was impossible, a breach of the Vaults of Terra. The vaults represented a tier of defense beneath the surface of the planet itself, a final layer of fortification protecting the innermost sanctum of the Emperor's palace, designed to be impenetrable against any assault that the architects of imperial defense could conceive. Perturabo conceived of what they could not. The breach was not achieved through brute force, it was achieved through the same patient, analytical methodology that had reduced 100 fortresses across the galaxy, applied now to the greatest engineering challenge of his career. He found the weakness that Dorn had not seen. He always found the weakness. In any other context, this would be the moment of supreme professional vindication, the master of siege warfare proving, at the ultimate test, that there was no fortification he could not breach. In the actual context, it was something else entirely, a man who had spent his life building things, using everything he knew to tear down the greatest thing humanity had ever constructed, in service of a cause he had never freely chosen, in the company of beings he did not trust, on behalf of a master he did not love. The vaults fell. And then the Emperor and Horus met, and everything changed, and none of it mattered in quite the way anyone had planned. The Siege of Terra. Of all the spaceports that served Terra, Lion's Gate was the most significant, a colossal structure of such strategic importance that its capture or denial could, by itself, alter the entire calculus of the siege. Whoever controlled Lion's Gate controlled the flow of material and reinforcement into and out of the palace complex at its most critical juncture. Both sides understood this. And it was Perturabo who understood it most completely. The operational plan for the assault on Lion's Gate bore his signature in every detail, not the signature of a name on a document, but the deeper signature of a particular quality of analytical thinking applied to a fortification problem of extraordinary complexity. The approaches were mapped. The defensive layers were identified and assessed. The sequencing of the assault was designed so that each phase created the conditions for the next, with the same architectural logic that Perturabo applied to every siege he had ever planned. Other commanders contributed to the assault. Other legions provided the warriors who executed it. But the conception, the underlying intelligence that transformed Lion's Gate from an objective into a solved problem, was Perturabo's. In the grim arithmetic of the Siege of Terra, the fall of Lion's Gate was one of the most consequential single developments of the entire campaign. And it fell because one mind, more than any other, had understood exactly how it would fall. There are siege weapons, and there are siege weapons designed with a specific enemy in mind, engineered not merely to breach fortifications in general, but to breach a particular set of fortifications built according to a particular philosophy by a particular architect. Dorn's Bane was the latter. The weapon, a siege engine of exceptional scale and destructive capability, was conceived by Perturabo as a direct answer to Rogel Dorn's defensive doctrine. Every choice in its design was a response to a specific aspect of how Dorn built and thought about fortification. Where Dorn's walls were thickest, Dorn's Bane concentrated its force. Where Dorn's designs relied on specific structural principles, Dorn's Bane exploited the vulnerabilities that those principles necessarily created. It was, in a very direct sense, an argument, a three-dimensional, kinetic argument made in metal and fire, constructed by a man who had spent decades thinking about nothing more intently than the weaknesses in his rival's philosophy. The name was not chosen modestly. Perturabo called it what it was, a weapon designed specifically to undo the work of the one Primarch whose craft most closely approached his own. Whether the naming was an expression of hatred, or professional contempt, or something more complicated, the cold satisfaction of finally having an answer to a question that had been open for too long, is difficult to say with certainty. Probably it was all three. The assault that came to be known as the Saturnine Operation was, in the broader context of the Siege of Terra, a masterstroke of deceptive planning, and it was Perturabo's masterstroke. The fundamental principle was simple in concept and enormously complex in execution. While the defenders of the palace focused their attention and resources on the most visible and expected axes of assault, a separate force would drive through a point that the defenders had assessed as secure. The genius was in the assessment of what the defenders would believe secure and why, understanding the logic of Dorn's defensive thinking well enough to predict exactly which approaches he would deprioritize, and then exploiting that deprioritization with the speed and violence necessary to convert a theoretical vulnerability into an actual breach before the defense could respond. Perturabo had been preparing this operation with the patience that characterized everything he did, building the conditions for it across the wider campaign, shaping the battle in ways that would make the Saturnine assault possible at the moment he chose to execute it. The operation cost the defenders of Terra dearly. It demonstrated, in the most direct possible terms, that Perturabo's understanding of how Dorn thought was not merely theoretical. He had mapped the architecture of his rival's mind as thoroughly as he had mapped the architecture of his fortifications. And both, in the end, had gaps. The scale of the Siege of Terra demanded assets beyond the conventional order of battle, assets that operated at a level of destructive power that compressed entire tactical problems into single engagements. Titans. The god machines of the Mechanicum, ranging from the swift and predatory Warhound class to the almost incomprehensible scale of the Imperator, were committed to the siege in numbers that had not been seen since the darkest days of the Age of Strife. Coordinating Titan assets in a siege environment is a task of considerable complexity. These are not weapons that can be pointed at a problem and released, they operate within an environment of other forces, require coordination with infantry and armor and artillery, and carry within them the risk of catastrophic friendly fire if their deployment is not managed with precision. Perturabo managed their deployment with precision. He incorporated the Titan assets available to the traitor forces into his operational planning as elements in a larger system, understanding their capabilities and limitations with the same thoroughness he brought to every other component of his order of battle, and placing them where analysis indicated they would have maximum effect within the coordinated whole. Under his direction, the Titans were not simply unleashed. They were used, which is a distinction that, in the hands of a lesser commander, might not always have been maintained. In the long and violent history of the rivalry between Perturabo and Rogel Dorn, there are many things that were never resolved, philosophical disputes that neither man had the temperament to concede, professional grievances that accumulated across decades without ever finding outlet, a competition for a prize that the Emperor had given to one of them and never acknowledged the other had wanted. The Siege of Terra brought all of this to a point of direct physical confrontation, and in that confrontation, Perturabo did something that relatively few beings in the galaxy had ever managed. He marked Dorn. The wound that Dorn carried away from their engagement, the scar that bore, in the informal histories, the name of the man who gave it, was not merely a physical injury. It was a proof, written in the most permanent available medium, that all of Perturabo's assessments of his rival had been correct. That the weaknesses he had identified in Dorn's philosophy were not merely theoretical. That the gap he had perceived, across all the years of their rivalry, between his own capability and his brother's, was real. Whether this gave Perturabo satisfaction is impossible to know with certainty. He was not, by temperament, a man who celebrated. But the scar existed, and Dorn carried it, and in the grim accounting of a rivalry that had defined so much of both their lives, it said something that decades of argument and achievement and mutual contempt had never quite managed to say directly. One of the qualities that distinguishes a truly exceptional commander from a merely excellent one is the ability to hold multiple simultaneous operational contexts in coherent view, to manage not just a battle but several battles at once, each one influencing the others, each one requiring its own decisions while remaining part of a larger integrated whole. During the Siege of Terra, Perturabo demonstrated this quality at a scale that even his previous career had not fully revealed. The siege was not a single front. It was a constellation of interconnected operations, assaults on different sections of the palace complex, actions in the void above the planet, subsidiary operations against defensive installations in the surrounding region, all of them proceeding simultaneously and all of them requiring coordination if any of them were to succeed. Perturabo coordinated them. He moved between operational contexts with a speed and completeness that his staff struggled to keep pace with, holding in his eidetic memory the current state of every war zone, the trajectory of every engagement, the supply state of every formation. He issued instructions for one front while processing intelligence from another while anticipating the developments on a third. It was, in the most demanding and consequential possible environment, the fullest expression of everything his mind was capable of. That it was also, in some measure, the fullest expression of everything the heresy had made him, that all this capability was being directed toward the destruction of the civilization he had helped build, was not a contradiction he had the luxury of dwelling on. There are moments in the history of the heresy when the language becomes, briefly, equal to the events it is describing, when the right words are spoken at the right moment and achieve something that pure military history cannot. Perturabo's most famous utterance is one of these moments. Delivered at the height of the assault on Terra, as the traitor forces stood at the threshold of the most significant military success of the entire siege, he spoke words that have been repeated and analyzed and debated ever since: "Tell them the angels of death have come." The phrase is remarkable for what it contains. It does not exult. It does not celebrate. It does not make claims about justice or destiny or the rightness of the cause being prosecuted. It is, in its structure, almost bureaucratic, an instruction to deliver a message. And yet the message itself carries an enormous weight. The angels of death. Not conquerors, not liberators, not reformers. Angels of death, beings whose arrival means not change but ending. There is a self-awareness in this that is distinctly Perturabo's. He knew what the Iron Warriors were. He knew what the siege was. He knew what his arrival at the gates of terror represented. And he chose, in the moment of maximum consequence, to name it honestly, in 4 words that contain no pretense about glory, no claim to righteousness, only the cold acknowledgement of what, exactly, had come. For a Primarch who had joined the heresy and fought under the banner of the ruinous powers, Perturabo's relationship with chaos itself was one of the more complicated and revealing aspects of his character. He had never embraced it. The forces of the warp represented everything his analytical materialist mind found most threatening: irrationality, entropy, the dissolution of structure into something that could not be measured or predicted or planned against. He used chaos as a tool, or attempted to, in the same way that a pragmatic general uses difficult allies, accepting the capabilities they offered while maintaining a cold distance from what they actually were. But the distance was always there. He did not speak the language of the dark gods with the enthusiasm of Lorga or the ecstatic abandon of certain of his other brothers. He did not seek to understand chaos on its own terms. He sought to contain it, to direct it, to ensure that it served his operational purposes rather than the reverse. Whether this posture was sustainable, whether you can truly use chaos as an instrument without eventually becoming its instrument in return, is one of the questions that the later history of the Iron Warriors answers, with considerable darkness, in the negative. But the rejection was genuine, and it lasted longer than most would have predicted for a man in his position. The practical expression of Perturabo's rejection of chaos was most visible in his response to demonic forces, to the entities of the warp that the heresy had unleashed into the material world in numbers and with a freedom of action that would have been unthinkable before Horus raised his banner. Other commanders integrated demon units into their operational planning with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Perturabo integrated them with visible distaste. The disorder inherent in demonic forces, their refusal to conform to predictable tactical behavior, their tendency to pursue objectives defined by their own incomprehensible appetites rather than by the operational plan, their fundamental incompatibility with the kind of precise coordinated methodology that the Iron Warriors embodied, offended him at a level that went beyond mere professional disagreement. He found them unreliable in the specific sense that mattered most to him. They could not be planned around. You could not build a siege operation with demon hordes as a key component the way you could with Iron Warriors assault teams, because the demons would not perform as specified. They would do something else instead, something spectacular, perhaps, something violent, almost certainly, but not the thing that the plan required of them at the moment the plan required it. For a mind that experienced the world as a set of engineering problems to be solved, this was not a manageable limitation. It was an affront. As the heresy reached its apocalyptic conclusion, as the Emperor and Horus met in the final confrontation that ended everything, Perturabo was not at the center of it. This is, in its way, significant. The man who had commanded the assault on Terra, who had breached the vaults, who had wounded Dawn and shattered Lion's Gate, withdrew. Not in the sense of a military retreat forced by circumstances, but in something more deliberate, a pulling back from the final act of a drama he had never entirely agreed to perform in. Whether this was a response to the death of Horus and the collapse of the enterprise that had consumed the last years of his life, or something that had been building longer, a gradual disengagement from a cause he had always served with his capability but never with his conviction, is difficult to establish precisely. What is clear is that Perturabo did not fight at the very end. He was present for the siege, and he was absent for the conclusion, and the distinction feels intentional in a way that the historical record does not fully explain but does not entirely obscure either. He had done what he had been pressed into doing. He had applied everything he had to a war he had not freely chosen. And when it ended, he withdrew, as he had always, in the deepest sense, been withdrawn, into himself, and into whatever came next. Vengeance and damnation. Talan, a desert world, transformed by viral bombardment into a wasteland so hostile to unprotected human life that the war fought across its surface became something unlike almost any other engagement of the heresy period. The virus bombs that had scoured Tallarn's surface of its former civilization had created an environment in which infantry operations were essentially impossible without sealed armor, and both sides responded to this constraint in the same way, with armor. Tanks. Thousands upon thousands of tanks, drawn from both traitor and loyalist reserves, committed to a world that had become, by the logic of military necessity, the largest armored battlefield in human history. Perturabo understood armored warfare with the same analytical completeness he brought to siege operations, the vectors of advance, the terrain features that channeled or denied movement, the firing lines and hull-down positions, and the precise mathematics of armor penetration at various ranges and angles. He directed the Iron Warriors' armored assets at Tallarn with a systematic ruthlessness that turned the desert into an abattoir. The scale of the destruction was almost beyond accounting. Vehicles and the men inside them destroyed in numbers that the records struggle to express without the figures losing their meaning. Tallarn was a slaughter, conducted across a blasted desert, in sealed vehicles, on a world that was already dead. In the history of the Iron Warriors, it sits as one more entry in a ledger of industrial violence that had been accumulating for a very long time. In the aftermath of the fighting on Tallarn, as the Iron Warriors withdrew and the desert resumed its terrible silence, something remained. Not a physical presence, not warriors left behind or material abandoned, but something less tangible and more persistent. The legend of the Tallarn Ghost. Among the surviving population of Tallarn, and among the warriors who had fought there on both sides, stories began to circulate of a presence that moved through the battlefield aftermath, an intelligence that seemed to observe, to assess, to move through the wreckage of the greatest armored engagement in history with the quiet purposefulness of a mind still working. Whether this presence was literal or mythological, whether it represented actual Iron Warriors' activity in the aftermath of the main engagement, or whether it was the kind of story that battlefields generate when the scale of what happened there exceeds what ordinary narrative can contain, is a question the sources do not resolve. What is interesting is the character of the legend itself, not a ghost of violence or terror, but a ghost of observation. A presence defined not by what it did but by what it saw. In the mythology of Tallarn, the echo left behind by the Iron Warriors was a watching intelligence, which is, in its way, a more accurate portrait of Perturabo than most of the dramatic accounts of his military career. The retreat into the Eye of Terror following the collapse of the heresy was not, for those who made it, a simple matter of crossing a border. The Eye of Terror is not a place in the conventional sense, it is a wound in reality, a region where the boundary between the material universe and the warp has been permanently compromised, where the rules that govern ordinary space do not apply with any consistency, and where navigation is less a science than a continuous negotiation with the incomprehensible. Getting in is dangerous. Getting out, when getting out is required, is something else entirely. At some point in the tumultuous period following the heresy's end, Perturabo found himself in a situation that required escape from a region of space that included, among its more conventional hazards, the gravitational demands of a black hole, a singularity whose appetite for matter and light does not distinguish between loyalists and traitors, between the righteous and the damned. The escape, as it is recorded, was an exercise in applied physics at the absolute edge of what was theoretically survivable, the kind of problem that required simultaneous mastery of void navigation, gravitational mechanics, and warp transit theory, all calculated in real time under conditions that did not allow for error. That Perturabo solved it is recorded as fact. How he solved it, the exact calculations, the precise sequence of decisions, would be worth entire libraries if they could be recovered. The Great Scouring was the Imperium's answer to the heresy, the long, grinding campaign of pursuit and retribution that followed Horus's defeat and sought to drive the traitor legions from the worlds they had claimed and punish them for what they had done to the galaxy. For the Iron Warriors, it was another kind of siege, except this time, they were behind the walls rather than in front of them. They had taken worlds during the heresy. They had built fortifications on those worlds, because wherever Perturabo's legion settled, fortification followed as inevitably as night follows day. And now the loyalist forces were coming to take those worlds back, and the Iron Warriors would make them pay for every meter. The scouring, for the 4th Legion, was not a rout or a collapse. It was a fighting withdrawal conducted with the same methodical precision as everything else they had ever done, contesting every position, making the cost of each recapture as high as possible, bleeding the pursuers at each fortified point before yielding it. It was, in its grim way, the ultimate expression of their doctrine, a legion so thoroughly optimized for defensive endurance that even being driven from the galaxy they had helped conquer could not be accomplished quickly or cheaply. The scouring cost the Imperium enormously. It was designed to. When the scouring was done, when the last of the traitor legions had been driven back and the Eye of Terror had swallowed what remained of Horus's great enterprise, the Iron Warriors found themselves in a condition that the historical record describes, with characteristic understatement, as exile. They were within the Eye. They were beyond the reach of imperial retribution in any immediate sense. And they were, in a way that Perturabo had never quite been before, without an external framework to push against. The Crusade had defined them. The heresy had consumed them. The scouring had tested them one final time. Now there was nothing but the Eye, and whatever they chose to build within it. For Perturabo, whose entire existence had been structured around the requirements of others, whose genius had been expended, campaign after campaign, in service of an imperium that had never adequately acknowledged it, the exile was a transformation in kind as much as in circumstance. There was no emperor to serve and resent. No assignment of the worst sieges while others received the glory. No Rogaldorn to be passed over in favor of. There was only the Eye, and the Legion, and whatever came next. Whether this was liberation or simply a different kind of imprisonment is a question that Perturabo's subsequent history suggests he found considerable difficulty in answering. The Iron Cage is one of the most debated actions in the post-heresy history of the Space Marine Legions, an operation so complex in its conception and so extreme in its execution that scholars have argued ever since about what Perturabo actually intended by it. What happened, in its external form, is not disputed. The Iron Warriors constructed a fortification complex of extraordinary size and sophistication on the world of Sebastus IV, a network of defenses that came to be known as the Eternal Fortress, and then, through various means, ensured that the Imperial Fists became aware of it. Rogaldorn, with a directness that Perturabo had presumably calculated upon, led his legion to Sebastus IV. And what followed was not a battle in any conventional sense but a trap, a killing ground designed from first principles as a mechanism for the systematic destruction of everything Dorn brought into it. The Iron Warriors had built their fortress knowing exactly who would come to assault it, and had designed it accordingly, incorporating Perturabo's complete knowledge of Dorn's tactical preferences, his doctrinal commitments, his responses under pressure. It was a fortification built not to defend a position but to destroy a specific enemy. A siege engine in the shape of a fortress. It was, in the darkest possible sense, the fullest expression of everything Perturabo knew how to do. The Iron Cage was not merely a military trap. Its purpose extended beyond the destruction of Imperial Fist's warriors in the immediate engagement, into something with longer and more terrible implications. The gene seed, the biological material that carries the genetic heritage of a Space Marine Legion, that is recovered from fallen warriors and used to create new brothers, of the Imperial Fists lost within the Iron Cage was not simply left on the battlefield. It was taken. Deliberately, systematically, as a planned component of the operation's objectives. The loss of Gene Seed at this scale was a wound to the Imperial fists that went deeper than the loss of the warriors themselves. It struck at the Legion's future, at its capacity to replenish and perpetuate itself, at the biological continuity that connected each generation of warriors to the last. This was Perturabo at his most coldly calculating, fighting not just the battle in front of him but the battles that would follow, targeting not just the warriors who had come to Sebastus for but the Legion they belonged to across a timeline that extended far beyond the engagement itself. And the Gene Seed, once taken, was put to use. The purposes to which it was directed, within the dark rituals and terrible ambitions of what the Iron Warriors were becoming, connect the Iron Cage to the next chapter of Perturabo's story, a chapter whose nature had been determined long before the last Imperial fist fell within the Eternal Fortress. The ascension of a mortal to demonhood, to the condition of a demon prince, a being of the warp elevated beyond the limitations of flesh into something that partakes of the nature of chaos itself, is not a gift that the dark gods distribute casually. It is an achievement of a particular and terrible kind, earned through service and sacrifice and the accumulation of a kind of favor that operates by rules entirely unlike those of the material world. The ritual by which Perturabo's ascension was achieved is not recorded in detail in any source available to conventional scholarship. The precise workings of such rituals are, by their nature, not documented in archives that Imperial historians can access. What is recorded is the fact of it, and the context in which it occurred, and some fragments of what was required. The Gene Seed of the Imperial fists, taken with such deliberate purpose from the Iron Cage, played a role. The accumulated weight of Perturabo's service to Chaos Undivided, however reluctant and however contested internally, was accounted. And whatever else was required, whatever was asked and given in the dark places of the Eye of Terror, in the presence of powers that do not make their demands in language that translates cleanly into human speech, it was met. The ritual was completed. And what emerged from its completion was no longer, in the strictest sense, the Primarch who had fallen to Olympia as a child and grown up in the shadow of Damocos's court. Among the traitor Primarchs who ascended to demonhood, the question of which of the four chaos powers they served is, in most cases, relatively straightforward. Lorga and the Word-Bearers belonged to chaos in a comprehensive sense, but with a theological emphasis that pointed toward particular powers. Mortarion was claimed by Nurgle with a completeness that eventually left no ambiguity. Magnus, for all his resistance, was drawn into the orbit of Tzeentch in ways that his own choices had made almost inevitable. Perturabo's allegiance was different. He served Chaos Undivided, not one power among the four, but all of them in their totality, or none of them in particular, depending on how you read the concept. This was consistent with his character in a way that single-power patronage would not have been. He had always been a materialist, an analyst, a man who refused to subordinate his judgment to any single framework or authority if a more comprehensive understanding was available. Chaos Undivided, in its strange way, offered something that service to a single patron did not, the refusal of a single defining narrative. He would not be Nurgle's servant, or Tzeentch's instrument, or Khorne's champion. He would be something harder to categorize, and therefore, in the logic of chaos, something harder to fully claim. And then there was the moment itself, the transformation, the crossing of a threshold that nothing in a Primarch's nature or training had been designed to accommodate. Perturabo became a demon prince. A being of the warp, elevated beyond mortality, possessed of power that operated outside the constraints of the material universe, no longer subject to the physical limitations that had defined even his extraordinary transhuman existence. What this transformation felt like, what it meant, subjectively, to be Perturabo in the moments of its completion, is not something the historical record can provide. What it meant in external terms is somewhat clearer. He was now something that the galaxy had produced very few examples of, a being who combined the intellect and analytical depth of one of the Emperor's Primarch sons with the immaterial power of a warp entity, no longer constrained by the attrition that had bled his legion, no longer vulnerable to the accumulated wounds of centuries of warfare, no longer subject to the slow grinding cost that the Iron Cage and Fall and the Rud and Olympia and all the rest had extracted from him. Whether the ascension resolved anything, whether it answered the questions that had defined his mortal existence, whether it gave him something that resembled what he had always been looking for, is a question that the post-ascension history of Perturabo does not answer simply or cleanly. Power is not the same as peace, and transformation is not the same as resolution. Among the more extraordinary capabilities that Perturabo's ascension and his long history of technological innovation combined to produce was a direct neural interface between himself and the Iron Circle, the cohort of battle automata that had served as his personal guard since before the heresy. The link that existed between the Demon Prince and his automata went beyond conventional remote control or vox-based command. It operated at the level of thought, translating intent directly into action across the Iron Circle with a speed and precision that no command and control system built from conventional technology could match. In practical terms, this meant that the Iron Circle functioned as an extension of Perturabo himself, not as separate units receiving instructions, but as additional limbs of a distributed consciousness, executing his will at the speed of neural impulse. The combat implications were significant. The philosophical implications were, perhaps, even more so. A being who had spent his entire life perceiving the weakness in every structure, who had never fully trusted any living person with his safety, who had chosen automata over warriors as his guard because machines offered loyalty that was structural rather than conditional. This being now had something as close to perfect control over his protectors as it was physically possible to achieve. He had engineered, in the end, the one relationship in his existence that could not betray him. Because it was not, in any meaningful sense, a relationship at all. Medrengard, the fortress without end. Within the Eye of Terror, where the laws of physics become suggestions and the boundary between thought and reality dissolves into something that resists coherent description, the most powerful servants of chaos are granted, or claim, or construct, the distinction being less clear here than anywhere else, worlds that reflect their nature. Demon worlds. Pocket realities shaped by the will and character of their masters, where the environment itself is an expression of the being at its center. For Perturabo, this meant a world built in his image, which is to say, a world that expressed, in physical and immaterial form, everything that the long centuries of his existence had made him. It is a place of iron and stone and terrible geometry, of fortifications that serve no purely military purpose because military purpose is only one layer of what they mean. It is a world that is simultaneously a monument and a prison, a masterwork and a record of grievance, a place of extraordinary dark beauty and of suffering so embedded in its architecture that the two have become inseparable. To walk Perturabo's demon world, if walk is the right word for movement in a place where direction is as much a matter of will as of physics, is to move through the interior of a mind. A mind that has been building walls for 10,000 years, and has never once stopped seeing, with perfect clarity, every crack in every wall it has ever made. The name is not metaphorical. Within the demon world that Perturabo has shaped from the raw stuff of the Eye of Terror, there stands, or exists, or persists, in the way that things persist in places where time does not behave reliably, a structure known as the Fortress of Hate. It is a fortification in the most complete sense that Perturabo has ever realized, which is to say it is the most formidable fortification in existence. Every principle he developed across 10,000 years of siege warfare and fortification theory has been applied here without the constraints that the material world imposes, without the limitation of available materials, without the friction of logistics, without the gap between the ideal and the achievable that tormented him throughout his mortal life. In the Eye of Terror, Will and reality are closer to the same thing than they are anywhere else, and Perturabo's will has always tended toward one expression above all others. The fortress of hate is what happens when the finest siege engineer in human history is given unlimited resources, unlimited time, and a domain in which the rules that previously prevented perfection no longer apply. It is, by any assessment, unassailable. It has never fallen. It was not designed to fall. It was designed by a man who spent his entire mortal life watching things fall, building a place where, finally, nothing would. The demon world itself has a name, Medrungard. And Medrungard is, before it is anything else, a labyrinth. Not a labyrinth in the decorative sense, not a garden maze or a puzzle designed for entertainment, but a labyrinth in the oldest and most functional sense of the word, a space designed to disorient, to contain, to ensure that those who enter it move only where its architect intends them to move. The passages and corridors and transitional spaces of Medrungard do not follow the logic of conventional architecture. They follow the logic of Perturabo's mind, which means they follow a logic of extraordinary precision and depth that is, to any mind less comprehensive than his, effectively indistinguishable from chaos. Routes that appear to lead toward a destination instead curve back on themselves. Distances that should be traversable in minutes expand into hours or contract into seconds depending on conditions that the traveler cannot perceive or predict. Spaces that were accessible by one path become inaccessible when approached from another. The labyrinth is alive, in the way that things in the Eye of Terror are alive, responsive, adaptive, aware of those who move within it. To enter Medrungard without Perturabo's guidance is not to explore. It is to be consumed, slowly, by an architecture that knows exactly where it wants you to go, and that has all of eternity to ensure you get there. The surface of Medrungard alone would be sufficient to establish it as one of the most heavily fortified locations in the known galaxy. But Perturabo's architectural ambition did not restrict itself to the surface. Above Medrungard, suspended in the blood-colored sky of the demon world, hang the sky fortresses, structures of immense scale that occupy the airspace of the world in the same way that surface fortifications occupy its ground. These are not merely elevated platforms or orbital installations translated into a demonic context. They are fully realized fortresses in their own right, each one a complete defensive system, each one capable of projecting force both downward onto the surface and outward into the surrounding space, each one connected to the others and to the surface fortifications in a network of overlapping fields of fire and mutual support that eliminates, as nearly as Perturabo can calculate, the concept of a safe approach vector. The sky fortresses serve functions that go beyond the purely military. They are also, in the context of Medrungard's nature as a demon world, expressions of dominion, physical assertions, written in iron and impossibility across the sky, that this world belongs to one mind and one will, and that the architecture of that belonging extends upward without limit, into the clouds and beyond them, because a mind like Perturabo's does not recognize the concept of a boundary it has not itself chosen to place. The 10,000 years since the heresy have not been, for Perturabo, a period of stasis. The mind that could not stop working during the Great Crusade, that produced innovations across disciplines at a rate that bewildered specialists who had spent entire careers in a single field, has continued to produce within the dark and boundless workshop of Medrungard. Freed from the constraints of imperial material science, freed from the limitations of conventional physics in a realm where those limitations do not apply absolutely, freed from the requirement to produce weapons and fortifications in service of someone else's agenda, he has had 10,000 years to work on the problems that interest him. The inventory of what has emerged from this period of dark productivity is not fully known to any source outside Medrungard itself. What is known, from the Iron Warriors' engagements with Imperial forces in the millennia since the heresy, is that the Legion continues to field technologies and weapons that exceed what conventional development would have produced, innovations that bear, in their design logic, the unmistakable signature of a specific analytical intelligence working at the furthest edge of what is possible. Perturabo has been building, in the dark, for 10,000 years. The galaxy encounters the results of this building periodically, in the form of things that should not exist, deployed with a precision that makes their origin unmistakable. Medrengard does not leave those who inhabit it unchanged. A demon world is not a neutral environment, it is an environment saturated with warp energy, shaped by the will of its master, and expressive of the nature of chaos in ways that act upon mortal flesh with a slow, grinding insistence that years of residence cannot entirely resist. The Iron Warriors who call Medrengard home are, by the standards of the Imperium they once served, profoundly altered. The mutations that accumulate in warriors who live within the Eye of Terror are not always the dramatic transformations of popular imagination, not always the obvious physical distortions that mark a servant of chaos as something other than human. Sometimes they are subtler, more structural, more deeply embedded in the biology of the individual. Sometimes they are exactly as dramatic as the imagination suggests. Among the Iron Warriors of Medrengard, the mutations tend toward the mechanical, an ironic correspondence with the Legion's identity that may reflect Perturabo's influence on the nature of the world itself, or may simply reflect the elective choices of warriors who, even in the mutating embrace of chaos, continue to express their identity through the imagery of iron and metal and the merger of flesh with machine. Whether these mutations are understood by the warriors who bear them as gifts, as costs, or as simply the accumulated evidence of where they have chosen to live, the answer probably varies from warrior to warrior, across a legion that has had 10,000 years to develop a complicated relationship with its own transformation. The Iron Circle that accompanied Perturabo from the final days of the Great Crusade have not remained static across the millennia of their master's exile. The Domitor-class automata that formed the original cohort were already extensively modified from standard Mechanicum configurations, rebuilt and refined by a Primarch whose understanding of their systems exceeded that of the engineers who had originally created them. In Medrengard, this process of modification has continued, and continued, and continued, across 10,000 years of a builder who never stops building, applied to constructions that are, within the Eye of Terror, as susceptible to warp influence as everything else. The Iron Circle have become something that the Mechanicum would struggle to categorize. They are still, in their essential structure, automata, machines, built things, operating on principles that have their origin in material engineering. But they have also absorbed, across the long centuries of their existence within the Eye, something of the nature of the realm they inhabit. They have become demon engines, constructs in which the boundary between machine and warp entity has blurred to the point where the distinction is less a clear boundary and more a matter of degree. They remain loyal. They remain extensions of their master's will. But what they are has drifted, like everything in the Eye, away from its original definition toward something that resists easy naming. Among the more extraordinary capabilities that Perturabo has developed or refined across his existence as a demon prince is a psychic null field, an ability to suppress or negate psychic activity within a defined area around him. This is, on its surface, a paradox, a being of the warp, a demon prince elevated by chaos, possessing the ability to neutralize the very psychic energies that define his nature. But the paradox resolves when you consider what Perturabo has always been. His relationship with the warp was never one of enthusiasm or embrace. It was always one of analysis and resistance, the lifelong attempt to understand something he found fundamentally threatening and to build, if not walls exactly, then at least frameworks that gave him some measure of control over it. The psychic null field is, in some sense, the ultimate expression of the anti-warp engineering principles he had been developing since his earliest years on Olympia. It is the ability, finally realized in its most complete form, to create around himself a space where the rules he prefers to operate by apply, where psychic power does not simply flow unchecked, where the analytical and the material have some purchase against the irrational and the immaterial. That he achieved this within the context of demonhood, having ascended into the very realm he spent his life trying to resist, is one of the stranger and more characteristic ironies of a life that has never been short of them. The theoretical work that Perturabo conducted in his earliest years, the investigations into resonance frequencies and psychic-resistant geometries and architectural configurations that might impede warp incursion, did not remain theoretical. Across the long centuries of the Great Crusade, the heresy, and the 10,000 years of exile that followed, it developed and deepened into a body of understanding that has had consequences far beyond anything the young Primarch on Olympia could have anticipated. The legacy of his anti-warp engineering exists on multiple levels. It exists in the physical architecture of certain Iron Warriors' fortifications, which incorporate structural elements that serve functions a conventional military engineer would not recognize, elements that interact with the warp in ways that are not fully understood even by those who build them, following design principles that were laid down by a mind that has been working on this problem for longer than most human civilizations have existed. It exists in the theoretical frameworks that inform the Iron Warriors' approach to warp phenomena, a distinctive analytical tradition that treats the immaterial with the same rigor applied to the material, refusing the mystification that most approaches to the warp eventually succumb to. And it exists, perhaps most significantly, in Perturabo himself, in the nature of the demon prince, in the psychic null field, in the way that a being who ascended into chaos has spent 10,000 years in the Eye of Terror and has still, somehow, not been entirely consumed by it. Among the more disturbing contributions that the Iron Warriors have made to the post-heresy galaxy is their association with the Obliterator virus, a techno-organic contagion of extraordinary complexity that transforms its hosts into obliterators, beings in which flesh and metal have merged so completely that the boundary between the biological and the mechanical has ceased to have any meaning. The obliterators are among the most feared heavy weapons platforms in the arsenal of chaos, capable of manifesting a vast range of weaponry from their own bodies, their physiology having become so thoroughly fused with the weapons they carry that manufacture and organism are now a single continuous thing. The origin of the Obliterator virus is attributed, in the most credible theoretical accounts, to Medrengard. To the workshop of a being who has spent 10,000 years at the intersection of flesh, machine, and warp energy, who has watched the mutations of his warriors trend toward the mechanical, who has spent a very long time thinking about what it would mean to truly merge the biological and the technological at the most fundamental level. Whether Perturabo created the Obliterator virus deliberately, as a design pathogen with intended effects, or whether it emerged from the general conditions of Medrengard as a kind of unintended consequence of everything that happens in that place, the theoretical accounts do not agree. What they agree on is the association, that the most complete merger of warrior and weapon that chaos has produced bears the signature, in its design logic, of the mind that has always been most interested in the question of how things are built, and what they can become. Epilogue: The War of Rust. 10,000 years is a long time to wait. But Perturabo has always been patient, patient in the way that only a mind with perfect memory and unlimited time can be patient, nurturing plans across timescales that would exhaust the attention of any lesser intelligence. The War of Rust marked one of the most significant returns of the Iron Warriors to prominence in the long millennia since the heresy, a campaign of such scope and destructive ambition that it announced, to a galaxy that had perhaps allowed itself to half forget what the Fourth Legion was capable of, that the architect of Medrengard had not been idle in his exile. The War of Rust was not simply a raid or an incursion of the kind that Chaos forces periodically launch against Imperial space. It was a statement, a demonstration, prosecuted with the full weight of everything Perturabo had spent 10,000 years developing, that the Iron Warriors remained exactly what they had always been. Perhaps more. The fortifications that Imperial forces had spent centuries constructing against Chaos incursion were, to Perturabo's eye, exactly what they had always been, structures with weaknesses, waiting for the mind that understood them well enough to find the point of failure. He had simply had 10,000 years of additional preparation before finding the opportunity to make his argument. The War of Rust made that argument in the only language that has ever felt entirely natural to him. Iron, and ruin, and the fall of walls that others had believed would hold. The desert of Tallarn does not forget. Long after the Iron Warriors withdrew, long after the last tank fell silent and the last soldier sealed their suit against the viral atmosphere and the echoes of the largest armored engagement in history faded into the dead air of a poisoned world, something remained. The hauntings of Tallarn are a matter of record that the Imperium has never satisfactorily explained, and has largely preferred not to examine too closely. Auspex returns that correspond to no physical presence. The sound, reported by garrison troops across generations of postings to the world, of engines that are not there. Tactical patterns observed in dust storms that bear too close a resemblance to armored maneuvers to be dismissed as coincidence by anyone with military training. Whether these phenomena represent actual warp activity, the residue of violence on a scale sufficient to leave a mark on the immaterial as well as the material, or something more deliberate, some thread of Perturabo's attention that has never quite withdrawn from a world that cost him so much and that he never entirely left, is not a question that has been answered. What seems clear is that Tallarn, for all its desolation, is not quite empty. There is something in the desert that watches. Something that remembers the battle in its entirety, every vehicle, every line of advance and retreat, every decision made and every soldier lost. Something with a perfect memory, and all the time in the universe, and no particular reason to move on. 10,000 years of exposure to the Eye of Terror. 10,000 years of warp saturation, demonic influence, and the accumulated mutations that chaos inflicts on everything it touches. 10,000 years in which the gene seed of every other traitor legion has drifted, corrupted, and transformed into something that bears increasingly little resemblance to the original genetic material from which it descended. And through all of it, the gene seed of the Iron Warriors has remained the most stable of all the traitor legions. This is remarkable. It is also, when you consider the source, entirely consistent. Perturabo spent his earliest years attending to gene seed purity with the same analytical rigor he applied to everything else, establishing standards and protocols that the Legion maintained with a consistency that other legions did not match. The habits of precision that he instilled in the Fourth Legion did not dissolve when the Legion crossed into the Eye of Terror. They persisted, because they were structural rather than circumstantial, embedded in how the Iron Warriors understood themselves, not merely in the conditions that had originally produced them. And Perturabo himself, the demon prince who has somehow maintained more of his original character across 10,000 years of chaos than almost any comparable being, is perhaps the ultimate expression of the same quality. The Iron Warriors do not mutate beyond recognition. They endure. It is, after everything, still what they do best. In the endless and consuming politics of the Chaos powers, the constant competition between Khorne and Tzeentch and Nurgle and Slaanesh for souls, for influence, for the incremental advantages of the Long War, Perturabo occupies a position that is as unusual as it is, in its way, characteristic. He belongs to none of them completely, and he has maintained this independence across 10,000 years in an environment where independence of this kind is vanishingly rare. Other traitor Primarchs were claimed. Mortarion belongs to Nurgle so thoroughly that the distinction between the Primarch and the Patron has become difficult to locate. Magnus serves the Architect of Fate whether he acknowledges it or not. Even those who resist the pull of a single patron tend, eventually, to drift toward one. Perturabo has not drifted. He serves chaos undivided with the same stubborn refusal to be fully claimed that he expressed toward every other authority that sought to define him throughout his mortal life. The Emperor could not entirely claim him. Horus could not entirely claim him. The individual dark gods, with all their immaterial power and their 10,000 years of patient attention, have not entirely claimed him either. He remains, in the deepest sense, his own, which in the context of chaos is an achievement of extraordinary stubbornness. Whether it represents genuine freedom, or simply the most elaborate cage he has ever built for himself, is a question that perhaps only he is positioned to answer. And he has not answered it. And so we come to the present, or what passes for the present, in a galaxy where 10,000 years of war have made the line between history and current events difficult to locate with any confidence. Perturabo is still there. In Medrengard, behind the walls of the Fortress of Hate, surrounded by the labyrinthine passages of his demon world, attended by an iron circle that has become something stranger than it once was, working on problems that have been open for millennia and on new problems that the changed galaxy continues to generate. He watches. Through the warp storms that roll across imperial space. Through the networks of intelligence and influence that a mind like his, with 10,000 years of preparation, has had ample opportunity to construct. Through the hauntings of Talon and the echoes that persist wherever the Iron Warriors have fought and bled and built and torn down. He watches with the same eidetic completeness that he has always brought to observation, missing nothing, forgetting nothing, assessing every weakness in every structure with the automatic, involuntary precision of a mind that was built for exactly this. The galaxy has changed enormously since Olympia. Since Damikos, and Caliphone, and the first siege that taught him what he was capable of. Since the Crusade and the heresy and the scouring and the long exile in the dark. It has changed, and it has not changed, because the things that Perturabo sees in it, the cracks, the weaknesses, the places where the walls are thinnest, are the same things he has always seen. The walls are always thin, somewhere. He has always known where. He is still watching, still waiting, still building in the dark. And somewhere, in the architecture of the galaxy's future, there is a siege he has not yet fought. He has already begun to plan it.